Across occupied Eastern Europe, thousands of mass graves had been created during the early years of the Holocaust. Entire communities had been murdered and buried in forests, fields, and remote clearings. For a time, these places remained hidden, known only to those who carried out the killings. Then, in 1942 and 1943, the war began to change. German leaders realized that the front lines were shifting. Soviet forces were advancing westward. Territories once firmly under Nazi control might soon fall into enemy hands. And with them, the graves. What followed was a secret operation designed not to kill, but to erase the evidence of the killings that had already taken place. The operation was called Action 1005. Under its orders, special units were sent across Eastern Europe to open mass graves, burn the bodies, and destroy every trace of the crimes committed there. It was an attempt to hide the Holocaust itself. In this documentary, we will explore the complete history of Action 1005, how it began, who organized it, how it operated, and the terrible work carried out in forests and fields across the occupied territories. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The landscape of the early mass graves. Long before the secret operation later known as Action 1005 began, vast stretches of Eastern Europe had already become silent burial grounds created during the early phases of the Holocaust. And understanding how these mass graves came to exist is essential to understanding why the Nazi leadership eventually attempted to erase them. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941 during Operation Barbarossa, the war in the East quickly took on a character very different from the fighting that had previously unfolded in Western Europe. The invasion was accompanied by a campaign of ideological warfare in which entire populations were defined by the Nazi regime as enemies to be removed from the territories that German forces intended to control. Special SS units known as Einsatzgruppen followed directly behind the advancing German army, operating in coordination with security police, Waffen-SS units, and local collaborators, and their task was not conventional military combat but the systematic elimination of people whom Nazi racial ideology had declared undesirable, particularly Jewish communities that had lived for generations across Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and other regions of Eastern Europe. In hundreds of towns and villages, Jewish residents were gathered together under the control of German authorities, often forced to assemble in market squares or near the edges of forests, and from there they were marched to prepared execution sites where shootings took place on a scale that would soon become one of the defining features of the Holocaust in its early stage. These massacres were frequently carried out in remote fields, ravines, sand pits, and forest clearings where large pits had been dug in advance, locations chosen specifically because they could be hidden from public view and quickly transformed into burial grounds once the shootings ended. The victims were forced to stand or kneel at the edge of these pits while armed units opened fire, and after each round of killing the bodies fell directly into the trenches where they were later covered with soil, creating mass graves that sometimes held hundreds or even thousands of people. By late 1941 and into 1942, this method of mass murder had been repeated across enormous areas of the occupied Soviet territories, leaving behind a landscape marked by thousands of burial sites scattered across forests and rural terrain. In places like Babi Yar near Kiev, Ponary outside Vilnius, and countless smaller locations whose names are known today primarily through historical research, entire communities disappeared within days, and the ground itself became the only remaining witness to what had occurred. At first, the German authorities believed that these graves would remain permanently hidden because the territories where the killings took place were expected to remain under long-term German control as part of the Nazi vision for the East. The shootings were therefore conducted with an emphasis on speed and secrecy rather than long-term concealment. And although some efforts were made to choose isolated locations, the bodies were generally left buried where they had fallen, covered with soil that often shifted over time as decomposition occurred beneath the surface. For months, the graves remained undisturbed while the war continued to expand across Eastern Europe, and during this period the Nazi leadership began transitioning toward new methods of mass killing in extermination camps equipped with gas chambers, which gradually replaced the earlier shooting operations as the central mechanism of the Holocaust. Yet the graves created during the first phase of the killings did not disappear. They remained scattered across the countryside, hidden but not erased, and as the war progressed, the existence of these burial sites began to present a problem for the Nazi authorities who had created them. By 1942, and especially by 1943, the military situation on the Eastern Front had begun to shift in ways that few German leaders had originally anticipated. Soviet forces were regrouping and launching counteroffensives that slowly pushed the German army westward, and territories that had once seemed permanently occupied were now at risk of being recaptured. This change introduced a new concern within the highest levels of the SS and Nazi administration. If the Red Army advanced far enough to reach the areas where the mass shootings had taken place, the graves themselves could become evidence of the crimes committed there. Tens of thousands of bodies lay beneath the soil in locations that could easily be discovered once German control collapsed. The presence of these graves threatened to reveal the full scale of the massacres carried out during the early stages of the Holocaust, exposing the systematic nature of the killings to the world. For leaders within the SS, particularly those responsible for coordinating security operations across occupied territories, this possibility raised an urgent question about how the evidence could be removed before enemy forces arrived. It was within this context that the idea emerged for a secret program whose purpose would not be to conduct new killings but to eliminate the physical traces of earlier ones. The mass graves scattered across Eastern Europe were no longer simply the result of previous operations. They had become a liability that the Nazi regime feared could reveal the reality of the Holocaust if left untouched. The forests, ravines, and fields where the shootings had taken place therefore became the starting point for a new phase of the story, one in which the same regime that had created these burial grounds now sought to destroy them in an attempt to hide the past. Action 1005 would eventually become the name of the operation designed to carry out this task. But at the moment when the graves were first created, no such plan yet existed. Instead, there was only the silent landscape of the killing fields themselves, places where the ground concealed evidence of the violence that had unfolded there, and where the soil would remain undisturbed for months before the Nazi leadership decided that the past needed to be erased. Understanding these burial sites is therefore the beginning of understanding Action 1005, because the operation that followed was born from the fear that the truth lying beneath the earth might one day be uncovered. Chapter 1, Segment 2. The scale of the killing fields across Eastern Europe. As the German invasion of the Soviet Union continued through the summer and autumn of 1941, the pattern of mass shootings carried out by SS Einsatzgruppen units and their supporting formations expanded across an immense geographic area, transforming large sections of Eastern Europe into what historians would later describe as landscapes of killing, places where forests, ravines, sand pits, and remote fields were turned into execution grounds as part of a systematic campaign aimed primarily at the destruction of Jewish communities living in territories newly occupied by Nazi forces. And this phase of the Holocaust unfolded with a speed and brutality that reshaped entire regions within a matter of months because the advancing German army created conditions in which civilian populations were suddenly placed under the control of security units whose mission was not administration but elimination. In town after town, the arrival of German authorities was followed by the registration of Jewish residents, the creation of temporary restrictions, and then the organization of mass executions that were often announced only hours before they took place, embedding the destruction of communities within the rhythm of military occupation as villages and cities across Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and parts of Russia became sites where violence occurred openly but under strict control from SS commanders directing the operations. The killings were frequently conducted on the outskirts of settlements where large natural features such as ravines or quarry pits could serve as ready-made burial locations, and in other cases prisoners or local laborers were forced to dig large trenches in advance of the shootings, illustrating how the preparation of the graves themselves became part of the process through which mass murder was carried out. In places like Babi Yar near Kiev in September 1941, more than 30,000 Jewish men, women, and children were killed over the course of 2 days, their bodies falling into the deep ravine where they were later covered with soil, and similar massacres took place across hundreds of lesser-known locations where the number of victims ranged from dozens to thousands depending on the size of the communities targeted. The Einsatzgruppen units responsible for coordinating these actions operated in close cooperation with other branches of the Nazi security system, including order police battalions, Waffen-SS units, and sometimes local collaborators who were recruited to assist with guarding prisoners or surrounding the execution sites, reinforcing the organized nature of the campaign and demonstrating how the extermination of Jewish populations was integrated into the broader structure of German occupation. Policy in the East. As the months passed, the number of mass graves multiplied rapidly because every major city and countless smaller towns became sites where shootings took place, and the landscape of Eastern Europe began to fill with burial grounds that remained largely hidden from outside observers but were well known to those who had participated in the operations. The victims were rarely buried individually. Instead, they were placed in large pits where bodies lay in layers, sometimes covered hastily with soil that shifted over time as decomposition occurred beneath the surface, creating uneven ground that local residents often recognized as the resting places of the dead. In many areas, these graves were located only a short distance from roads or villages, and although guards attempted to restrict access, the presence of disturbed earth and the memory of the shootings themselves meant that the sites were not completely invisible to surrounding communities. Survivors, witnesses, and local inhabitants sometimes remembered the locations of these graves long after the war, and their testimony later became essential for historians attempting to map the scale of the massacres that had taken place during the early phase of the Holocaust. By the end of 1942, it is estimated that more than 1 million Jewish victims had been murdered through these mass shooting operations alone, leaving behind an immense network of burial sites scattered across forests, fields, and ravines throughout the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. The graves varied in size and location, but together they formed a hidden geography of destruction that stretched across thousands of kilometers, connecting places that had once been ordinary landscapes with events that fundamentally altered their historical meaning. At the time, the Nazi authorities responsible for these killings believed that the territories where the graves were located would remain under German control indefinitely, because the early months of the war had created the impression that the Soviet Union might collapse under the pressure of the invasion. This assumption shaped the way the executions were carried out because the perpetrators did not initially focus on long-term concealment of the graves. Instead, their priority was speed and efficiency as they carried out orders to eliminate entire populations within newly conquered regions. The bodies were therefore left buried in locations that could be covered quickly, sometimes with minimal effort to disguise the sites beyond a thin layer of soil and the expectation that the surrounding countryside would remain inaccessible to outsiders. Yet, as the war progressed, the military situation began to change, and the enormous number of graves created during the first phase of the Holocaust gradually became a source of concern for the SS leadership. By 1942, reports from the Eastern Front indicated that Soviet forces were reorganizing and beginning to launch counteroffensives that challenged the stability of German occupation in several areas, raising the possibility that some of the regions where the mass shootings had taken place might eventually fall back into Soviet hands. If this happened, the burial sites left behind by the Einsatzgruppen could be discovered, revealing the evidence of crimes that the Nazi regime had previously assumed would remain permanently hidden. This realization introduced a new dimension to the problem posed by the killing fields because the graves themselves had become silent witnesses to the massacres carried out during the early years of the war. The scale of the burial sites meant that they could not easily be ignored or explained away once discovered, and the possibility that enemy forces might uncover them created a sense of urgency among those responsible for managing the security apparatus of the occupied territories. The forests, ravines, and fields where the bodies lay buried were therefore no longer merely remnants of past operations, but potential sources of evidence that threatened to expose the systematic nature of the killings. Within the SS hierarchy, this concern eventually led to discussions about how the graves might be removed or destroyed before advancing armies reached them, setting the stage for the creation of a secret program whose purpose would be to eliminate the physical traces of the massacres that had taken place across Eastern Europe. The vast network of burial sites created by the Einsatzgruppen thus became the foundation upon which a new operation would soon be built, one designed not to carry out new killings but to erase the evidence of those that had already occurred. Chapter 1, Segment 3. The Problem of Evidence When the Graves Became a Threat. By the time the year 1942 progressed toward its later months, the enormous network of mass graves scattered across Eastern Europe had begun to represent something the Nazi leadership had not fully anticipated when the shootings first began, because what had originally been seen as a temporary solution for disposing of victims had gradually transformed into a dangerous form of evidence lying silently beneath the soil of the occupied territories. And this shift in perception occurred largely because the wider military situation on the Eastern Front was no longer unfolding according to the expectations that German planners had held at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. During the early months of the invasion, the rapid advance of the German army had created the impression that the Soviet Union might collapse quickly, and within that context the mass shootings carried out by the Einsatzgruppen and associated police units were conducted with the assumption that the conquered regions would remain under German control for many years. The burial pits dug in forests and ravines were therefore treated as permanent resting places that would never be examined by outside authorities, because the Nazi regime believed it would continue to dominate these territories indefinitely. However, as the war continued into late 1942 and early 1943, the strategic reality changed dramatically. The German army encountered increasing resistance, and major battles such as those fought around Stalingrad revealed that the Soviet Union retained both the capacity and the determination to push German forces back toward the West. As Soviet counteroffensives gained momentum, the possibility emerged that regions previously occupied by Germany might eventually be recaptured by the Red Army. This development carried enormous implications for the thousands of mass graves that had been created during the earlier phase of the Holocaust. Beneath the soil of forests and fields lay the bodies of countless victims whose deaths had been documented only in limited internal reports or not recorded at all. And if enemy forces were to uncover these graves, they would immediately reveal the scale and nature of the killings carried out by German security units. Within the SS leadership, this prospect began to generate growing concern, particularly among officials responsible for coordinating security and intelligence operations across occupied Europe. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and other high-ranking figures understood that the discovery of these graves could expose the systematic extermination campaign that had been conducted throughout the Eastern territories. The problem was not limited to a few isolated sites. Rather, it involved thousands of burial locations stretching across vast regions of Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Western Russia. Some graves contained hundreds of bodies, while others held tens of thousands, and their presence represented a physical record of events that the Nazi regime had previously assumed would remain hidden. The soil itself had become a form of testimony, capable of revealing the truth about the massacres once the territories changed hands. Reports from local SS commanders began to emphasize the risks posed by these burial sites, noting that decomposition sometimes caused the ground above the graves to shift or collapse, making the locations more visible to anyone passing nearby. In certain areas, the smell from decomposing bodies could also become noticeable, particularly during warmer months, further increasing the likelihood that the graves might attract attention. These practical realities reinforced the fear that once German forces withdrew from the region, investigators or local inhabitants could easily identify the sites where mass killings had taken place. The Nazi leadership therefore faced a new challenge that had not existed when the shootings first began: the need to eliminate the physical traces of crimes that had already been committed. Discussions within the SS hierarchy gradually focused on the idea of reopening the graves, removing the bodies, and destroying them in a way that would leave little evidence behind. Such an operation would require careful organization because the burial sites were spread across enormous distances and often located in remote areas where transportation and labor would need to be arranged under conditions of secrecy. At the same time, the individuals assigned to carry out the work would need to be controlled closely, since the process of reopening graves and burning bodies would inevitably expose the scale of the earlier massacres to those involved. Despite these challenges, the concept of eliminating the graves gained support among senior SS officials who viewed it as a necessary step to prevent the crimes of the Holocaust from being discovered by advancing enemy forces. By early 1943, the plan had begun to take shape as a coordinated program overseen by the SS and implemented by specialized units that would travel from site to site reopening burial pits and destroying the remains. The program would later become known by the administrative designation Action 1005, a name derived from internal SS documentation that concealed the true nature of the operation behind a numerical code. Its purpose was not to create new graves but to remove the old ones, turning the killing fields of Eastern Europe into places where the evidence of earlier massacres would be systematically erased. The forests, ravines, and fields that had once served as execution grounds would soon become the focus of a grim effort to rewrite the physical record of the Holocaust itself. What had begun as a campaign of mass shootings was now entering a new phase in which the perpetrators attempted to destroy the traces of their own actions. The graves that lay beneath the soil had become a threat to those who created them, and the decision to eliminate them marked the beginning of one of the most secretive and disturbing operations carried out by the Nazi regime during the war. Chapter 2, Segment 1. The decision to erase the graves. By early 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had begun to produce a new reality for the Nazi leadership, one that gradually forced them to reconsider the long-term consequences of the mass killings carried out during the first phase of the Holocaust. And this shift in thinking emerged not from any moral reflection on the crimes themselves, but from a growing awareness that the physical evidence of those crimes might eventually be discovered if German control over the occupied territories began to weaken. During the initial months of Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi regime had believed that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly, allowing Germany to permanently dominate vast areas of Eastern Europe, and under that assumption, the mass graves created by the Einsatzgruppen and other killing units were treated as permanent burial sites that would never be investigated by outside authorities. However, as the war continued through 1942 and into 1943, the situation changed dramatically. Soviet resistance proved far stronger than expected, and the German army began to face serious military setbacks that indicated the conflict might last far longer than originally planned. Within the SS leadership, this development triggered a new concern that had not been present when the shootings first began. If the Red Army eventually advanced westward and retook territory previously occupied by German forces, the burial pits scattered across forests, ravines, and rural fields could easily be discovered, revealing the scale of the massacres that had taken place during the early stages of the war. Reports from various regions already indicated that the graves were difficult to conceal permanently because decomposition beneath the soil sometimes caused the ground to collapse or shift, exposing bones and clothing that could attract attention from local residents or anyone traveling through the area. These warnings reinforced the growing fear that once German authority collapsed in a particular region, the mass graves would become undeniable evidence of the systematic extermination campaign carried out by Nazi security units. Within the SS hierarchy, discussions therefore began about how to eliminate this evidence before advancing enemy forces could uncover it. The problem was immense in scale because the shootings had taken place across a vast geographic area stretching from the Baltic states through Ukraine and deep into Western Russia, leaving behind thousands of burial sites containing hundreds of thousands of bodies. Removing these graves would require a coordinated operation capable of traveling from one location to another while maintaining strict secrecy, since the process of reopening mass graves would inevitably reveal the full extent of the earlier killings to those involved in the work. Despite the logistical difficulties, The idea of destroying the graves gained increasing support among senior SS officials who viewed it as an essential step in preventing the crimes of the Holocaust from being exposed to the world. One of the key figures in shaping this policy was Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, whose authority over the SS and police apparatus allowed him to issue directives concerning the management of security operations across occupied Europe. Himmler had already overseen many aspects of the extermination campaign and understood that the burial sites created during the mass shootings represented a permanent record of those actions if they were left undisturbed. The fear of discovery became particularly urgent after the German defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943, which demonstrated that the Soviet army was capable of launching powerful counteroffensives that could push German forces back across the territories where the killings had occurred. Within this changing military context, Himmler authorized the development of a secret program designed specifically to eliminate the physical traces of the mass graves. The operation was given the internal designation Aktion 1005, a numerical code that concealed its purpose within official SS documentation and allowed orders to be issued without openly describing the task being carried out. The responsibility for organizing and supervising the operation was assigned to SS officer Paul Blobel, a man who had already been deeply involved in the earlier phase of mass shootings and who possessed direct knowledge of the burial sites created by the Einsatzgruppen. Blobel had previously commanded Sonderkommando units responsible for massacres in Ukraine, including the killings at Babi Yar near Kiev, and his familiarity with both the methods of execution and the locations of burial pits made him a logical choice to lead the effort to remove the evidence of those crimes. Under Blobel's direction, specialized teams were assembled with the task of traveling to execution sites, reopening the mass graves, removing the bodies, and destroying them through burning so that little physical trace would remain. This process required not only technical planning but also a labor force capable of carrying out the physically demanding work of exhuming and transporting decomposed bodies, and for this purpose prisoners, often Jewish detainees taken from nearby camps or ghettos, were forced to perform the labor under armed guard. These prisoners would later become known as Sonderkommandos within the context of Aktion 1005, and their tragic role in the operation reflected the brutal logic of the Nazi system in which victims themselves were compelled to participate in the destruction of evidence connected to earlier killings. The decision to launch Aktion 1005 therefore marked the beginning of a new phase in the history of the Holocaust, one in which the perpetrators attempted not only to carry out mass murder but also to erase the physical record of their actions. Forest clearings, ravines, and execution pits that had once served as burial grounds were transformed into sites where bodies were exhumed and burned in large open-air cremation structures constructed from railway tracks, logs, and fuel. Smoke from these fires sometimes rose above the surrounding trees, creating a grim signal that the ground itself was being emptied of the evidence it once held. The objective of the operation was simple yet horrifying in its implications: to ensure that when enemy forces eventually reached these territories they would find as little proof as possible of the massacres that had taken place there. Aktion 1005 was therefore not merely a technical effort to dispose of bodies but a deliberate attempt to conceal the truth of the Holocaust by destroying the graves that bore witness to its earliest and most widespread phase. Chapter 2, Segment 2. The Organization of a Secret Operation. Once the decision had been made within the leadership of the SS to remove the evidence of the mass shootings carried out across Eastern Europe, the next challenge was to transform that decision into a practical system capable of operating across a vast geographic area while remaining largely hidden from public knowledge, and this task required the creation of a specialized structure within the SS security apparatus that could coordinate the reopening of mass graves, the destruction of bodies, and the concealment of the work itself under conditions of strict secrecy. The responsibility for organizing this effort was placed under the authority of Heinrich Himmler, who as Reichsführer SS oversaw the entire SS and police network throughout Nazi Germany and the occupied territories, and within that hierarchy a central role was assigned to SS officer Paul Blobel, a man whose previous involvement in the early mass shootings had given him direct familiarity with the locations of many burial sites created during the Einsatzgruppen operations of 1941 and 1942. Blobel had commanded Sonderkommando for one of the units responsible for the massacres carried out in Ukraine, including the killing at Babi Yar near Kiev, where tens of thousands of Jewish victims were murdered in a single ravine over the course of 2 days, and his experience within the system of organized mass violence made him a figure whom the SS leadership trusted to carry out the grim responsibility of eliminating the traces of those earlier crimes. Under Blobel's direction, the program that would later be known as Action 1005 began to take shape as a coordinated series of operations carried out by small mobile units that could travel between execution sites scattered across the occupied territories. And because these burial locations were spread across thousands of kilometers, the operation required careful planning to identify which graves would be addressed first and how the work would be conducted without drawing attention from nearby populations or enemy intelligence. The numerical designation 1005 was used as an internal administrative code within SS documents, allowing orders to be issued and reports to be filed without openly describing the nature of the activity taking place. And this coded terminology reflected the extreme secrecy surrounding the program, since even many German officials were not fully informed about its true purpose. The operational teams created under Action 1005 were composed primarily of SS personnel and police units who provided supervision and security, but the physical labor required to reopen graves and burn bodies was not carried out by these men themselves. Instead, prisoners were forced to perform the work under armed guard, often selected from nearby labor camps, ghettos, or detention facilities where Jewish prisoners and other detainees were held. These prisoners were organized into special labor groups that were compelled to dig into the burial pits, remove decomposed bodies, and transport them to large open-air cremation structures constructed near the execution sites. The construction of these cremation platforms became a technical process developed through experimentation during the early stages of the operation, because burning large numbers of bodies required a method capable of sustaining intense heat over extended periods. In many locations, railway tracks were arranged in parallel lines on top of stone or brick supports, creating a grill-like structure upon which layers of bodies and firewood could be stacked before being set alight. Once the fires began, they burned continuously, sometimes for days, reducing the remains to ash and bone fragments that were later crushed or scattered to further obscure the evidence. This method allowed the SS teams to destroy thousands of bodies at a single location, although the process was slow and physically demanding for the prisoners forced to carry it out. The men assigned to these labor units were kept under strict surveillance because they possessed direct knowledge of the earlier massacres and of the efforts being made to conceal them, and the SS leadership understood that if these witnesses survived, they could later reveal what had taken place. For that reason, the prisoners involved in Action 1005 were rarely allowed to live long after completing their assigned tasks. Once a burial site had been cleared and the bodies burned, the laborers who had carried out the work were typically executed in order to prevent them from testifying about the operation. This grim cycle of forced labor followed by execution became one of the defining characteristics of Action 1005. Reflecting the determination of the SS leadership to eliminate not only the physical evidence of the mass shootings, but also the human witnesses who might expose the truth. Meanwhile, the operational teams continued moving from one site to another as the program expanded, reopening graves that had been dug months or even years earlier during the initial phase of the Holocaust. The forests and ravines where these massacres had taken place were transformed into scenes of another terrible process in which the earth was disturbed once again, this time not to bury victims but to remove them from the ground entirely. The work was carried out quietly and often in remote areas where access could be restricted by guards, but despite these precautions, the smoke from the cremation fires sometimes rose above the surrounding trees, and the smell of burning bodies occasionally drifted toward nearby villages. Local residents in certain regions later recalled seeing these fires or noticing unusual activity in forests where German security units had established temporary camps during the operation. Even so, the overall secrecy of Action 1005 remained largely intact during the war because the SS maintained tight control over the areas where the work took place, and because the advancing front lines of the conflict meant that many of these locations remained inaccessible to outside observers. Through this combination of coded administration, mobile operational units, forced prisoner labor, and systematic destruction of bodies, the Nazi regime created a mechanism designed to erase the physical record of the early mass shootings that had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives across Eastern Europe. The organization of Action 1005 therefore represented a new stage in the effort to conceal the Holocaust, demonstrating that the same system capable of carrying out mass murder was also capable of attempting to eliminate the evidence of its own crimes. Chapter 2, Segment 3. Paul Blobel and the command structure behind Action 1005. At the center of the operation that would become known as Action 1005 stood a man whose earlier role in the mass shootings had already placed him deeply inside the machinery of the Holocaust, and understanding his position within the SS hierarchy helps reveal how the decision to destroy the graves was transformed into an organized campaign carried out across the occupied territories of Eastern Europe. That man was SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel, an officer whose career within the Nazi security apparatus had developed through the same ideological structures that shaped the broader SS system, where loyalty to the regime and obedience to orders were presented as absolute principles guiding the behavior of those entrusted with implementing Nazi racial policy. Blobel had joined the SS in the years before the war and later became a member of the Sicherheitsdienst, the intelligence service of the SS, placing him within a network of officials responsible for monitoring political opposition and enforcing the racial ideology of the Nazi state. When Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Blobel was assigned command of Sonderkommando 4A, a unit within Einsatzgruppen that followed the German army into Ukraine with orders to eliminate Jews, political officials, and other groups identified by the regime as enemies. Under Blobel's leadership, this unit participated in some of the largest mass shootings of the early Holocaust, including the massacre at Babi Yar near Kiev, where tens of thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were murdered over 2 days in September 1941 and buried in the ravine outside the city. The experience gained during these operations meant that Blobel possessed direct knowledge of both the methods used in the shootings and the locations where the victims had been buried, making him an individual whose familiarity with the killing fields of Eastern Europe was unusually extensive. When the SS leadership later began discussing the need to remove the evidence of those earlier massacres, Blobel therefore emerged as a logical figure to oversee the project. Heinrich Himmler, who held ultimate authority over the SS and police system, approved the creation of a special operation tasked with reopening the mass graves and destroying the bodies, and Blobel was appointed to organize and direct this effort. Within the internal documentation of the SS, the program was identified through the numerical code 1005, a designation that concealed its true purpose behind administrative language that would not easily reveal the nature of the work being carried out. Blobel's assignment required him to establish a command structure capable of coordinating activities across a wide territory while maintaining strict secrecy. And to accomplish this, he assembled small operational groups composed of SS personnel and police units who could travel between different execution sites and supervise the process of exhuming and burning the bodies buried there. These teams operated under the authority of the SS and police leadership in each region but reported back through channels connected to Blobel's office, creating a system in which the central direction of the operation remained under his control even as the work itself unfolded in many distant locations simultaneously. The command structure also reflected the hierarchical organization typical of the SS, where orders flowed downward through layers of authority and where obedience to directives from higher-ranking officials was expected without question. Blobel's role therefore involved not only logistical planning but also the enforcement of discipline within the units carrying out the operation, ensuring that the men involved maintained secrecy and followed the procedures designed to eliminate the physical evidence of the earlier killings. One of the most important aspects of the operation was the use of prisoner labor to perform the exhausting and disturbing tasks required to reopen burial pits and remove decomposed bodies. The SS personnel overseeing the work generally avoided direct participation in these activities, instead forcing prisoners, often Jewish detainees taken from nearby camps or ghettos, to carry out the labor under armed guard. These prisoners were organized into temporary work detachments that were compelled to dig into the graves, lift bodies that had been buried for months or years, and transport them to cremation structures constructed nearby. The process was both physically and psychologically devastating, and the prisoners involved were fully aware that they were participating in the destruction of evidence connected to the murders of their own communities. Within the command system of Action 1005, this labor force was considered expendable, and once a burial site had been cleared, the prisoners who had performed the work were typically executed to prevent them from revealing what they had seen. This practice reflected the broader logic of the operation itself, which was designed not only to destroy bodies but also to eliminate witnesses who might later testify about the crimes being concealed. As the program expanded during 1943 and 1944, Blobel's operational teams moved from one location to another across the Eastern Territories, reopening graves left behind by the Einsatzgruppen and reducing their contents to ash through the use of large open-air cremation fires. Each site presented its own logistical challenges because the graves varied widely in size and condition depending on when and how the original massacres had taken place, and Blobel's organization had to adapt its methods to these different environments while maintaining the overall objective of removing as much evidence as possible before advancing Soviet forces reached the area. Despite the effort invested in this operation, the scale of the earlier killings meant that it was impossible to eliminate every burial site scattered across Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, the creation of Action 1005 represented a determined attempt by the SS leadership to erase the physical record of the Holocaust's early phase, and Paul Blobel's position within the command structure placed him at the center of that effort. His role illustrated how the same individuals who had directed the original massacres were now entrusted with the task of concealing them, transforming the landscapes of mass murder into scenes where the past was deliberately disturbed in an effort to hide the truth buried beneath the soil. Chapter 3, Segment 1. The first exhumations, reopening the killing fields. When the operation later known as Action 1005 began to move from planning into action during 1942 and especially into 1943, the landscapes that had once served as execution grounds during the early mass shootings of the Holocaust were transformed once again, this time not by new massacres but by a systematic effort to reopen the burial pits where victims had been placed months or even years earlier, and this process marked the beginning of a grim phase in which forests, ravines, and remote fields across Eastern Europe became sites where the past itself was physically disturbed in an attempt to erase its traces. The first exhumation operations were conducted in areas where the scale of the earlier massacres was especially large, and where the advancing front lines of the war made it increasingly likely that the graves might soon be discovered by enemy forces. In places such as Ukraine and Belarus, where Einsatzgruppen units had carried out extensive mass shootings during 1941 and 1942, the burial sites were often located in wooded areas or along the edges of rural settlements where large pits had been dug to receive the bodies of victims executed in rapid succession. When the SS teams assigned to Action 1005 arrived at these locations, they established temporary camps nearby, usually guarded by armed personnel who restricted access to the surrounding area so that the work could proceed without interference from local residents or travelers. The first task facing the operational units was to identify the precise location of the graves, a process that often relied on records kept by earlier SS units, testimony from local collaborators, or the visible signs left behind by disturbed soil that had settled unevenly over time. Once the burial pit was located, prisoners forced into labor detachments were ordered to begin digging into the ground, carefully removing layers of soil until the first bodies appeared beneath the surface. The work was physically exhausting and emotionally devastating because the corpses had often been buried for many months, and decomposition had transformed the graves into spaces filled with the remains of victims whose clothing, bones, and personal belongings were sometimes still visible within the soil. The prisoners assigned to this task were compelled to use shovels and sometimes their hands to pull the bodies from the pit, lifting them onto the surface where they were arranged for transport to nearby cremation structures that had been constructed in advance by the SS supervisors. These cremation platforms were designed to burn large numbers of bodies at once, typically built using metal railway tracks placed across stone or brick supports to create a grid through which flames and heat could circulate. Beneath the structure, wood was stacked to create a fire strong enough to sustain the burning process. And once the bodies were placed on top, the entire structure was ignited, producing intense heat that gradually reduced the remains to ash and fragments of bone. The burning could last for many hours or even days depending on the number of bodies being destroyed, and during this time the prisoners were forced to remain nearby to tend the fires and add additional fuel when necessary. Smoke from these cremation fires often rose above the surrounding trees, and in some cases the smell carried by the wind could be noticed by villages located several kilometers away, although the SS units guarding the operation attempted to maintain secrecy by restricting movement in the area and warning local inhabitants not to approach the sites where the work was taking place. The prisoners performing the labor were closely supervised by armed guards who ensured that the tasks were carried out continuously, because the objective of Action 1005 was not merely to reopen the graves but to remove the bodies completely so that the burial sites would no longer exist as evidence of the earlier massacres. Once the bodies had been burned, the remaining ash and bone fragments were often crushed using tools or mechanical devices and then scattered across the ground or buried again in shallow pits, further reducing the possibility that the remains could later be identified. This process was repeated at site after site as the operational teams moved through different regions of the occupied territories, following lists of execution grounds where mass shootings had previously taken place. In some locations, the burial pits were relatively small, containing the bodies of victims from a single village or town, while in others they were enormous trenches that held thousands of victims killed during large-scale massacres carried out by Einsatzgruppen units in the early months of the war. Each grave required the same grim sequence of tasks: excavation, removal of bodies, burning, and disposal of the ashes. For the prisoners forced to perform this labor, the experience was deeply traumatic, not only because of the physical demands of the work, but also because many of them recognized that the remains they were handling belonged to members of the same communities from which they themselves had been taken. The SS personnel overseeing the operation maintained strict control over the labor detachments because they understood that these prisoners had direct knowledge of the crimes being concealed, and therefore the prisoners were rarely allowed to survive once the work at a particular site had been completed. After a burial pit had been cleared and the evidence destroyed, the laborers were typically executed and replaced with new prisoners brought in for the next location, ensuring that witnesses to the operation were eliminated along with the physical traces of the earlier massacres. Through this brutal cycle of forced labor and execution, the SS units implementing Action 1005 began systematically reopening the killing fields created during the first phase of the Holocaust, turning burial grounds that had once been silent markers of the shootings into sites where the remains of victims were deliberately destroyed in an effort to hide the truth buried beneath the earth. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Building the cremation systems in the forests. As the early exhumation operations of Action 1005 continued across the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, the SS teams responsible for carrying out the program quickly discovered that reopening the graves was only the first stage of a far larger logistical problem, because the burial pits created during the earlier mass shootings often contained enormous numbers of bodies, and destroying them required a method capable of handling thousands of remains under conditions that were both efficient and secretive. The operation therefore required the development of cremation systems that could function outdoors in remote locations where no permanent infrastructure existed, and this challenge led to the creation of large open-air burning structures designed specifically for the purpose of reducing bodies to ash. The construction of these systems became one of the defining features of Action 1005, and the methods used reflected a grim form of experimentation in which SS personnel refined techniques for burning large numbers of corpses while relying on forced prisoner labor to carry out the physically demanding work required to build and operate the fires. In many locations, the cremation platforms were constructed using railway tracks that were removed from nearby rail lines or transported to the site for this purpose. And these heavy metal rails were arranged in parallel rows on top of stone or brick supports to create a grid-like surface elevated above the ground. Beneath this structure, logs and branches were stacked to form the base of the fire, and once the bodies were placed on top, the wood was ignited, producing intense flames that gradually spread upward through the layers of remains. This method allowed air to circulate through the structure, increasing the heat of the fire and ensuring that the burning process continued for long periods without collapsing the platform. The construction of these cremation systems was carried out almost entirely by prisoners who had been forced into labor detachments under SS supervision, and the work often began before the graves themselves were opened because the burning structures needed to be ready as soon as the bodies were removed from the pits. Prisoners were ordered to gather firewood from the surrounding forests, carry heavy railway tracks into position, and assemble the supports that would hold the platforms above the ground. Guards monitored the work constantly, ensuring that the structures were built quickly and according to the instructions given by the SS officers overseeing the operation. Once the platforms were completed, the process of exhumation and burning could begin in a continuous cycle that lasted for days or weeks depending on the size of the burial site. Prisoners digging into the graves would pass the bodies upward to other laborers who carried them to the cremation platform, where they were stacked in layers interspersed with additional wood or fuel to sustain the fire. When the stack reached a certain height, the entire structure was ignited, and once the flames began to spread, the prisoners were forced to remain nearby, adding more fuel when necessary and rearranging the remains as they burned in order to ensure that the fire consumed everything placed upon the platform. The heat generated by these fires was immense, and the burning sometimes continued through the night as the SS guards illuminated the area with lanterns or temporary lighting, while the labor detachments continued their work. Smoke rose above the surrounding trees in thick columns that could be seen from a distance, and although the operation was intended to remain secret, the presence of these fires sometimes attracted attention from nearby villages or travelers passing through the region. The SS units responsible for the work attempted to limit such attention by restricting access to the surrounding area and warning local residents not to approach the forests where the fires were burning. But despite these precautions, the scale of the cremation operations made complete secrecy impossible in certain locations. For the prisoners forced to operate the cremation platforms, the experience was relentless and exhausting, as they were required to work for long hours lifting bodies, carrying wood, and tending fires that burned continuously until the burial pits had been emptied. The process did not end when the flames died down, because once the bodies had been reduced to ash and fragments of bone, the remains had to be further destroyed in order to eliminate any recognizable evidence of the victims. Prisoners were therefore ordered to collect the remaining bone fragments and crush them using hammers, heavy tools, or specially designed grinding devices before scattering the ashes across the ground or burying them in shallow pits nearby. This final stage of the operation was intended to ensure that even if the area was later examined, there would be little visible proof that a mass grave had once existed at the site. The SS personnel supervising the operation kept careful watch over the labor detachments throughout this process, not only to maintain the pace of the work, but also to prevent prisoners from escaping or communicating with anyone outside the guarded perimeter of the site. The men forced into these units were fully aware that they were witnessing and participating in the destruction of evidence connected to the earlier massacres, and for this reason the SS leadership considered them dangerous witnesses who could not be allowed to survive once their tasks were completed. In many cases, the prisoners who had worked at a particular cremation site were executed after the graves had been cleared, and new labor detachments were brought in for the next location where Action 1005 teams continued their grim work. Through this method, the SS units responsible for the operation developed a system capable of eliminating enormous burial pits that had once contained thousands of victims, turning the killing fields of Eastern Europe into landscapes where the earth itself was emptied of the bodies it had held since the early phase of the Holocaust. The construction and operation of these cremation systems, therefore, became central to the effort to erase the evidence of the mass shootings, demonstrating the determination of the Nazi regime not only to carry out mass murder, but also to conceal its physical traces as the war continued. Chapter 3, Segment 3. The prisoners forced to destroy the evidence. Behind the technical methods and operational planning of Action 1005 stood a group of individuals whose experiences formed one of the most tragic and disturbing aspects of the entire operation, because the labor required to reopen mass graves and burn the bodies of victims was not carried out primarily by SS personnel themselves, but by prisoners who were forced into special work detachments and compelled to participate in the destruction of evidence connected to the very crimes that had devastated their communities. These prisoners were usually selected from nearby ghettos, labor camps, or detention facilities under German control, and in many cases they were Jewish men taken from populations that had already been targeted by the Nazi extermination campaign. Once selected, they were transported under guard to the execution sites where the burial pits were located, and there they were placed under the authority of SS officers and police units responsible for supervising the operation. The prisoners assigned to these labor groups were often referred to as Sonderkommandos within the context of Action 1005, a term that describes special detachments created to perform tasks connected to the extermination process. Their role was not voluntary in any sense. Refusal meant immediate execution, and survival depended entirely on obeying the orders given by the guards overseeing the work. Upon arrival at a burial site, the prisoners were usually housed in temporary barracks or makeshift shelters constructed near the location where the graves were being reopened, and they were kept under constant surveillance to prevent escape or contact with the outside population. Armed guards surrounded the work area, and the prisoners were marched each day from their sleeping quarters to the burial pits where the labor began. The first stage of their work involved digging into the ground to expose the graves, removing layers of soil until the bodies buried beneath became visible. Because many of the graves had been created months or even years earlier, the corpses were often in advanced stages of decomposition, and the prisoners were forced to handle the remains with shovels, ropes, or their bare hands as they lifted them from the pits. The bodies were then carried to the cremation platforms that had been constructed nearby, where they were stacked in layers along with firewood and other materials designed to sustain the burning process. Throughout this work, the prisoners were constantly watched by guards who enforced discipline through threats and violence, ensuring that the pace of the operation remained steady, because the SS leadership considered the destruction of the graves to be an urgent priority as the war continued. The physical conditions of the labor were extremely harsh, as the prisoners worked long hours under difficult circumstances while exposed to the smoke and heat of the cremation fires that burned continuously once the bodies were ignited. In many cases, the men assigned to these tasks had little access to adequate food, water, or rest, and the combination of exhaustion and the emotional strain of handling the remains of victims created an atmosphere of despair within the labor detachments. Some prisoners recognized clothing or personal items belonging to people from their own towns or families among the remains they were forced to remove from the graves, a realization that deepened the trauma of the work and reinforced the cruel logic of the system in which victims themselves were compelled to erase the physical traces of the massacres. The SS officers supervising the operation viewed the prisoners not as individuals but as temporary tools required to complete a specific task, and the command structure of Action 1005 reflected this attitude by treating the labor detachments as expendable resources rather than human beings. Once a burial site had been cleared and the bodies destroyed, the prisoners who had performed the work were rarely allowed to survive. The SS leadership understood that these men possessed direct knowledge of both the original mass shootings and the later effort to conceal them, and therefore they were considered dangerous witnesses whose testimony could reveal the truth about the crimes committed in the region. For that reason, the labor detachments were often executed after completing their tasks, sometimes at the same sites where the graves had just been emptied. In certain cases, new groups of prisoners were brought in to replace those who had been killed, continuing the cycle of forced labor followed by execution as the Action 1005 teams moved from one burial site to another. Despite the strict control imposed by the guards, there were occasional attempts by prisoners to escape or resist the conditions imposed upon them, although such efforts were extremely dangerous and rarely successful because the work sites were heavily guarded and often located in remote areas where escape routes were limited. Nevertheless, the possibility of resistance remained present, and in some locations prisoners attempted to sabotage the work or plan uprisings in hopes of avoiding execution once their tasks were completed. These acts of defiance, though often crushed quickly by the SS units in charge, demonstrated that even within the harsh conditions of Action 1005 there remained individuals who sought ways to challenge the system that had forced them into participation. The experiences of these prisoners later became one of the most important sources of information about the operation itself, because a small number of survivors were eventually able to provide testimony describing how the graves were reopened and the bodies destroyed. Their accounts revealed the details of the cremation structures, the organization of the labor detachments, and the methods used by the SS to eliminate evidence of the earlier massacres. Through these testimonies, historians gained insight into a secret program that had been designed specifically to erase the traces of the Holocaust's early phase. The prisoners who were forced to work within Action 1005 therefore played a tragic role within the operation. They were compelled to destroy the physical evidence of crimes that had already taken countless lives, even as the system that controlled them prepared to eliminate them as witnesses once their work was done. Chapter 4, Segment 1. The expansion of Action 1005 across Eastern Europe. As the program known internally within the SS as Action 1005 moved beyond its earliest experimental stages, it gradually expanded into a coordinated operation that spread across large portions of Eastern Europe, following the geographic path of the earlier mass shootings carried out during the first years of the Holocaust. And this expansion reflected the growing determination of the Nazi leadership to eliminate the physical traces of those killings before advancing enemy forces could uncover them. During the initial phase of the Holocaust in 1941 and 1942, the Einsatzgruppen and associated police units had carried out mass shootings across territories that stretched from the Baltic states through Belarus and Ukraine and deep into western regions of the Soviet Union, leaving behind thousands of burial sites scattered across forests, ravines, fields, and remote rural areas. Each of these locations represented a potential record of the crimes that had taken place there. And as the war continued, the SS leadership became increasingly aware that these graves might one day be examined by investigators if German control over the region began to weaken. By 1943, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front had begun to change significantly, with Soviet forces pushing westward and German units gradually retreating from territories that had once been securely occupied. This shift created a sense of urgency within the SS hierarchy because the graves left behind during the early mass shootings were located precisely in those regions now threatened by advancing Soviet armies. The decision was therefore made to accelerate the work of Action 1005 and extend its operations across as many execution sites as possible before the changing front lines made access to those areas impossible. Under the direction of Paul Blobel and the command structure established within the SS security apparatus, specialized teams were organized to travel through the occupied territories and carry out the systematic reopening of burial pits wherever earlier massacres had taken place. These teams were small but mobile, composed of SS personnel and police units who provided supervision and security, while prisoner labor detachments carried out the physically demanding tasks required to exhume the bodies and burn them. Because the burial sites were scattered across such a vast region, the operational groups often moved from one location to another over the course of several weeks or months, following lists compiled from earlier Einsatzgruppen reports and local administrative records that indicated where mass executions had occurred. In many cases, the graves were located in wooded areas chosen during the original shootings for their isolation and ease of concealment. And when the Action 1005 teams arrived, they established guarded perimeters around the sites to prevent local residents from approaching while the work was carried out. The expansion of the operation meant that cremation systems similar to those used during the earliest exhumations were constructed repeatedly in different regions, with railway tracks, wooden supports, and large quantities of fuel transported or gathered locally to create the open-air burning platforms required to destroy the remains removed from the graves. These fires sometimes burned for days as thousands of bodies were gradually reduced to ash, and the smoke rising above the forests became an unsettling sign that the ground itself was being emptied of the victims buried there during the previous phase of the Holocaust. In regions such as Ukraine and Belarus, where the scale of the earlier massacres had been enormous, the burial pits often contained the remains of entire Jewish communities that had been executed during mass shooting operations conducted by the Einsatzgruppen and their collaborators. Reopening these graves required extensive labor, and the prisoners forced into the work detachments were compelled to dig through layers of soil until the bodies were exposed, then carry them to the cremation platforms where they were stacked and burned under the supervision of SS guards. The expansion of Action 1005 also meant that the operation began to intersect with other parts of the Nazi camp system, as prisoners from labor camps, ghettos, and concentration camps were transported to these execution sites to serve as temporary labor forces. Once the work at a particular location had been completed, the prisoners who had carried out the exhumations were typically executed in order to eliminate witnesses who could later describe what had taken place. This brutal pattern repeated itself as the operational teams continued moving across the region, reopening graves and destroying evidence in one location before traveling onward to the next. Despite the SS leadership's determination to eliminate the burial pits left behind by the early massacres, the sheer number of execution sites created during 1941 and 1942 meant that it was impossible to address every grave before the advancing Soviet forces reached the area. Nevertheless, the expansion of Action 1005 demonstrated how seriously the Nazi regime regarded the danger posed by these graves as potential evidence of the Holocaust. The operation therefore represented a systematic attempt to alter the landscape of Eastern Europe by removing the physical traces of mass murder, turning forests and fields that had once served as silent burial grounds into places where the past was deliberately disturbed and erased in an effort to hide the scale of the crimes committed there. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Operations in Ukraine and the sites of the largest mass shootings. As Action 1005 expanded during 1943, some of its most extensive and grim operations unfolded across Ukraine, a region where the earlier phase of the Holocaust by mass shootings had reached a scale that few other areas of occupied Europe had experienced, and it was here that the effort to reopen graves and destroy the bodies buried within them revealed the enormous geographical footprint left behind by the Einsatzgruppen and their collaborators during the first years of the war. When German forces invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Ukraine quickly became one of the central theaters of the Nazi extermination campaign because of its large Jewish population and its strategic importance within the German plan for domination of Eastern Europe. Within weeks of the invasion, mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen began following the advancing German army into towns and cities throughout the region, carrying out systematic mass shootings that targeted Jewish communities along with political officials, Roma populations, and others whom the Nazi regime considered enemies. These executions were often conducted in ravines, forests, or abandoned quarries located near the outskirts of settlements, where victims were gathered, forced to stand at the edges of prepared pits, and shot in large groups before their bodies were buried in mass graves. Over the course of 1941 and 1942, hundreds of such sites were created across Ukraine, forming a vast network of killing fields that stretched across the countryside. Among the most well-known of these locations was Babi Yar, a deep ravine near the city of Kiev where in late September 1941 tens of thousands of Jewish residents were murdered in one of the largest single massacres of the Holocaust. Similar execution sites existed in numerous other towns and regions, including areas around Kharkiv, Dnipro, and smaller communities scattered throughout the Ukrainian landscape. When the SS leadership began implementing Action 1005, these graves became a central focus of the operation because they represented unmistakable evidence of the mass shootings that had taken place during the early years of German occupation. Under the supervision of Paul Blobel and the SS command structure established for the program, specialized operational teams were dispatched to Ukraine with orders to reopen the burial pits and eliminate their contents before the advancing Soviet army could reclaim the territory and potentially uncover the graves. The work began by identifying the locations of the execution sites, often using records kept by the original killing units or information provided by local collaborators who had witnessed the earlier events. Once a grave had been located, the SS units established a guarded perimeter around the area and transported prisoners to the site to serve as forced laborers. These prisoners, frequently Jewish detainees taken from nearby camps or ghettos, were ordered to dig into the soil until the buried bodies were exposed, then lift the remains from the pits and carry them to large cremation platforms constructed nearby. These platforms, typically built from railway tracks placed on stone supports, allowed fires to burn beneath the stacked bodies with sufficient heat to reduce them to ash over the course of many hours or even days. The process was repeated continuously until the graves had been emptied, with prisoners working under the watch of armed guards who ensured that the labor proceeded without interruption. In Ukraine, the scale of these operations could be enormous because many burial pits contain thousands of victims from earlier massacres, and the exhumation of such graves required sustained effort over extended periods. Smoke from the cremation fires sometimes rose above the surrounding forests in thick columns that could be seen from nearby villages, creating an eerie reminder that the ground itself was being disturbed once again. Although the SS attempted to maintain secrecy by restricting access to the sites, local residents occasionally noticed the activity and later recalled seeing the fires or smelling the smoke drifting across the countryside. The prisoners forced to perform this labor endured extremely harsh conditions, working long hours while handling decomposed remains and tending fires that burned continuously as the bodies were destroyed. Once the graves had been cleared and the ashes scattered or buried again, the SS personnel overseeing the operation typically executed the labor detachments in order to eliminate witnesses who could reveal what had taken place. This pattern repeated itself as Action 1005 teams moved from one execution site to another across Ukraine, reopening graves that had once served as silent markers of the earlier massacres. Despite the scale of the effort, however, the vast number of killing fields scattered across the region meant that it was impossible to destroy every burial site before the shifting front lines of the war forced German forces to withdraw. As Soviet armies advanced westward during 1943 and 1944, many areas where mass shootings had occurred were liberated before Action 1005 units could reach them, leaving behind graves that later became crucial evidence in post-war investigations of Nazi crimes. Even so, the operations carried out in Ukraine demonstrated the determination of the SS leadership to conceal the record of the Holocaust wherever possible, transforming landscapes already marked by tragedy into places where the past itself was deliberately excavated and burned in an attempt to erase the physical memory of the massacres that had occurred there. Chapter 4, Segment 3. Operations in Belarus and the Forest Graves of the East. As Action 1005 continued to expand across the territories occupied by Nazi Germany, Belarus became another central region where the operation was carried out with particular intensity, because the landscape of this country had been deeply marked by the earlier phase of the Holocaust in which mass shootings were conducted across forests, villages, and rural clearings throughout 1941 and 1942. Leaving behind thousands of burial sites that the SS leadership now sought to eliminate before the advancing Soviet army could uncover them. Belarus, situated between Poland and the western regions of the Soviet Union, had quickly fallen under German occupation during the opening months of Operation Barbarossa, and within a short time the same pattern that had already unfolded in other parts of Eastern Europe began to take shape as Einsatzgruppen units, German police formations, and local collaborators carried out systematic massacres against Jewish communities and other targeted groups. Towns and villages that had existed for generations suddenly became places where entire populations were gathered, marched to nearby forests or fields, and executed in large groups before being buried in mass graves dug in advance for that purpose. Because Belarus contained vast wooded areas and sparsely populated rural landscapes, the execution sites were often located deep within forests where the shootings could be conducted away from public view. The burial pits created during these massacres remained scattered across the countryside long after the killings had taken place, and by the time Action 1005 began its work, many of these graves had already been covered by soil, leaves, and natural growth that slowly concealed their presence beneath the forest floor. Yet beneath that quiet surface lay the remains of thousands of victims, whose deaths had formed part of the wider extermination campaign unfolding across the Eastern Territories. When the SS command responsible for Action 1005 turned its attention toward Belarus during 1943, the objective was the same as in other regions: to reopen the graves, remove the bodies, and destroy them through burning so that the physical evidence of the earlier massacres would disappear. Special operational teams moved into the region under the authority of the SS security apparatus, traveling from one site to another using information gathered from earlier Einsatzgruppen reports, local administrative records, and sometimes the testimony of residents who had witnessed the shootings. Upon arriving at a suspected burial site, the SS units established guarded zones around the area, often selecting remote forest clearings where the work could proceed without attracting attention from nearby settlements. Prisoners were then transported to these locations to serve as forced laborers, frequently drawn from Jewish detainees who had been held in labor camps or ghettos elsewhere in the occupied territories. Once at the site, the prisoners were ordered to begin excavating the burial pits, digging carefully through layers of soil until the bodies buried beneath the surface began to appear. The graves in Belarus varied widely in size depending on the scale of the earlier executions, with some containing the remains of dozens of victims, while others held thousands who had been murdered during large-scale operations against entire communities. Removing these bodies required sustained labor, as the prisoners lifted them from the pits and carried them to cremation platforms constructed nearby under the supervision of SS guards. These cremation structures followed the same design used in other regions of Action 1005, typically consisting of heavy railway tracks placed across stone or brick supports to create a raised grid through which flames could pass while the bodies burned above. Beneath the structure, wood was stacked in large quantities to provide the fuel necessary for the fires, and once the bodies were arranged on top, the entire platform was ignited, producing intense heat that gradually reduced the remains to ash. In many cases, the fires burned continuously for days as the bodies from the graves were destroyed layer by layer, with prisoners forced to maintain the flames by adding additional wood and adjusting the remains so that the burning process continued without interruption. The smoke rising from these fires sometimes drifted through the forests of Belarus and could occasionally be seen from distant villages, although the SS attempted to restrict movement in the surrounding areas in order to prevent people from approaching the sites where the work was taking place. Throughout this process, the prisoners performing the labor remained under constant surveillance because they possessed direct knowledge of the graves being opened and the efforts to destroy their contents. The SS leadership regarded these laborers as temporary tools rather than witnesses who could be allowed to survive, and therefore once the work at a particular burial site had been completed, the prisoners who had carried out the exhumations were often executed in order to prevent them from later revealing what they had seen. This grim cycle repeated itself across numerous locations in Belarus as Action 1005 teams continued traveling through the region, reopening graves and burning their contents in an attempt to erase the traces of the earlier massacres. Yet, despite the effort invested in these operations, the vast number of execution sites scattered across the forests and fields of Belarus meant that it was impossible for the SS to eliminate every grave before the changing course of the war brought Soviet forces back into the region. As the Red Army advanced westward during the later stages of the conflict, many areas where mass shootings had taken place were liberated before Action 1005 units could reach them, leaving behind burial pits that would later become important evidence in post-war investigations of Nazi crimes. Even so, the operations carried out in Belarus illustrated how far the Nazi regime was willing to go in its attempt to conceal the physical record of the Holocaust, turning landscapes that had already witnessed immense tragedy into places where the ground itself was disturbed and emptied in a calculated effort to hide the truth buried beneath the soil. Chapter 5, Segment 1. The secrecy and control of Action 1005. As Action 1005 expanded across the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, The leadership of the SS placed enormous emphasis on secrecy and strict operational control, understanding that the success of the operation depended not only on the physical destruction of bodies but also on preventing the wider world from learning that such an effort to erase evidence was taking place. The mass shootings of 1941 and 1942 had already left behind a vast network of burial sites scattered across forests, ravines, and rural landscapes, and these graves contained the remains of hundreds of thousands of victims murdered during the early phase of the Holocaust. If these sites were discovered intact by advancing enemy forces or investigators after the war, they would provide undeniable proof of the systematic nature of the killings. The SS leadership therefore approached Action 1005 not simply as a logistical operation but as a highly sensitive mission that required careful concealment at every stage. Orders relating to the operation were circulated through coded references within SS administrative documents, with the designation 1005 functioning as an internal identifier that revealed little about the true purpose of the program. Even within the German military and administrative structures, many officials were not fully informed about what the operation involved, and the work itself was carried out primarily by small specialized units that operated with limited visibility outside the SS security system. This structure allowed the operation to proceed while minimizing the number of individuals who possessed direct knowledge of its objectives. The sites chosen for exhumation were often located in remote areas where access could be controlled easily, particularly in forests or isolated fields where the earlier mass shootings had already taken place away from public view. When an Action 1005 team arrived at such a location, one of its first tasks was to establish a guarded perimeter around the area. Armed guards were posted along paths or roads leading toward the site, and local residents were warned not to approach the area. In some cases, nearby populations were told that military exercises or other restricted activities were taking place in the forest. A simple explanation intended to discourage curiosity without revealing the real reason for the presence of SS personnel. Within this secured zone, the work of reopening graves and burning the bodies could proceed with minimal outside observation. The prisoners forced to carry out the labor were kept under even stricter control. These men were usually transported to the execution sites under guard and housed in temporary camps or enclosed areas located near the graves themselves. They were not allowed to move freely beyond the boundaries of the work site, and contact with local populations was carefully prevented. Guards accompanied them constantly, both during their labor and during the limited hours of rest that followed. The SS officers supervising the operation understood that these prisoners were witnesses to one of the most secret aspects of the Holocaust: the deliberate effort to destroy evidence of earlier mass murder. For that reason, the prisoners were treated as expendable labor whose survival was not intended to extend beyond the completion of their assigned tasks. Once a burial site had been cleared and the bodies burned, the labor detachment that had performed the work was often executed, and a new group of prisoners was brought in for the next location. This brutal cycle ensured that very few individuals survived long enough to describe the details of the operation while it was underway. The secrecy surrounding Action 1005 also influenced the way its operational teams moved across the landscape. Rather than maintaining large permanent installations that might attract attention, the SS units typically established temporary working sites that existed only as long as the graves in that area required attention. Cremation structures were constructed quickly using materials that could be gathered locally or transported from nearby rail lines, such as railway tracks and wooden beams. Once the bodies had been burned and the ashes scattered or buried again, these structures were dismantled or left to collapse, leaving little visible trace that the site had been used for such a purpose. The ground where the graves had existed was often leveled or covered with soil to blend into the surrounding terrain. In some cases, trees or vegetation were planted over the area to restore the appearance of an undisturbed forest floor. Through these measures, the SS attempted to transform places that had once been mass burial sites into landscapes that appeared ordinary and unremarkable. Yet, despite the effort invested in maintaining secrecy, The scale of the operation made it difficult to conceal completely. The cremation fires produced thick smoke that sometimes rose above the treetops and could be seen from distant villages, and the smell of burning carried by the wind occasionally reached nearby communities. Some residents later recalled noticing unusual activity in forests where German security units had established restricted zones, although few understood the full nature of what was occurring there. The secrecy of Action 1005 therefore depended not only on SS control but also on the broader wartime environment in which information moved slowly and access to occupied territories remained limited. The advancing front lines of the war also created pressure to complete the work quickly. As Soviet forces pushed westward during 1943 and 1944, the SS units responsible for the operation were forced to accelerate their activities or abandon sites that had not yet been cleared. In many regions, the retreat of German forces meant that the graves could not be destroyed before Soviet troops arrived, leaving behind evidence that would later play a crucial role in documenting the crimes of the Holocaust. Nevertheless, during the period when Action 1005 was actively operating across Eastern Europe, the combination of coded administration, controlled work sites, restricted prisoner movement, and the systematic elimination of witnesses allowed the SS leadership to conduct one of the most secretive operations of the entire Nazi extermination program. The effort to maintain secrecy around this operation demonstrated the awareness within the Nazi regime that the crimes committed during the Holocaust were acts that the perpetrators themselves expected would one day be judged by the world, and in response they attempted to erase the physical record of those crimes before that judgment could occur. Chapter 5, Segment 2. Witnesses, Rumors, and the Limits of Secrecy. Despite the intense secrecy that surrounded Action 1005 and the strict control imposed by the SS over the locations where the operation was carried out, the complete concealment of such a vast and disturbing undertaking proved impossible, and across several regions of occupied Eastern Europe fragments of information slowly spread among local populations, prisoners, and even some German personnel, creating rumors and partial awareness that something unusual and deeply unsettling was occurring in forests and remote areas where German security units had suddenly established restricted zones. The effort to erase the evidence of earlier mass shootings required the reopening of graves that had been created during the first phase of the Holocaust, and because many of those burial sites were located not far from villages or rural roads, the presence of SS personnel and forced labor detachments sometimes drew attention from nearby communities even when access to the sites themselves was tightly controlled. In certain areas, residents noticed convoys of vehicles transporting prisoners under guard toward forests that had previously been known as execution grounds, and over time people began to observe smoke rising repeatedly from those same locations. The cremation fires used to destroy the bodies produced thick columns of smoke that could be visible from a considerable distance, especially when they burned continuously for several days while large burial pits were being emptied. In some places, the smell carried by the wind also reached nearby settlements, creating an atmosphere of unease among those who lived close enough to notice the strange activity but were prevented from approaching the guarded areas where it originated. German authorities often responded to such curiosity with warnings that the forests were restricted military zones or locations of security operations, explanations designed to discourage questions without revealing the true purpose of the work taking place there. At the same time, the prisoners forced to perform the labor of exhuming and burning the bodies possessed direct knowledge of the operation's nature, and within the guarded camps where they were temporarily housed, the awareness that they were participating in the destruction of evidence connected to mass murder created a tense and fearful environment. Many of these prisoners had already lived through earlier stages of persecution, having been taken from ghettos or labor camps before being transported to the burial sites where Action 1005 teams required laborers. Once there, they witnessed firsthand the reopening of graves and the cremation of bodies that had been buried months or even years earlier, and this experience left no doubt about the scale of the crimes being concealed. Although the prisoners were kept under constant surveillance and were rarely allowed to communicate with outsiders, the possibility of escape remained a concern for the SS guards who supervised the work. In some locations, individuals did attempt to flee into the surrounding forests, hoping to reach partisan groups or sympathetic villagers who might help them survive beyond the boundaries of the operation. Such escapes were rare and extremely dangerous because the work sites were heavily guarded and often located far from populated areas. Yet even a few successful escapes meant that fragments of information about the operation began to circulate beyond the immediate control of the SS units carrying it out. In addition to prisoner escapes, another source of knowledge about the operation came from local workers or collaborators who were occasionally compelled to assist in logistical tasks, such as transporting materials or providing supplies to the German units stationed near the cremation sites. These individuals might not have been permitted to observe the exhumations directly, but they sometimes saw the smoke rising from the forests or heard conversations among guards that hinted at the nature of the work taking place there. Over time, such observations contributed to a growing sense among certain communities that the Germans were attempting to remove something hidden beneath the ground in places where earlier killings had occurred. Even within the German administrative system, there were individuals who became aware that a secret operation was underway. Although the strict hierarchy of the SS and the coded language used in official documents meant that most personnel outside the immediate chain of command did not fully understand what Action 1005 involved. The secrecy of the program relied heavily on compartmentalization, a method by which information was restricted to those directly responsible for carrying out specific tasks. As a result, many soldiers or officials stationed near areas where the operation occurred might notice unusual activity without being told the reason behind it. This atmosphere of partial awareness and uncertainty meant that rumors about the reopening of graves and the burning of bodies circulated quietly in various parts of the occupied territories, even while the SS attempted to suppress open discussion of the subject. Despite these efforts, the broader context of the war also played a role in limiting the effectiveness of secrecy. As the conflict intensified and front lines shifted rapidly, the control that German authorities could exert over large areas of Eastern Europe began to weaken. Partisan movements operating in forests and rural regions gathered information about German activities and sometimes passed that information along to Soviet intelligence networks. In this environment, the existence of unusual fires or guarded work sites in forests occasionally reached the attention of resistance groups who attempted to document or report what they believed to be evidence of German crimes. Although the full scope of Action 1005 remained largely unknown during the war itself, these scattered observations and testimonies created a record that later helped investigators reconstruct what had taken place. The limits of secrecy, therefore, became increasingly visible as the war progressed, because the very scale of the operation made it difficult to hide completely from those living nearby or from the prisoners forced to participate in the work. While the SS leadership believed that destroying the bodies buried in mass graves would remove the most direct evidence of the earlier massacres, the memories of witnesses and the accounts of survivors ensured that the attempt to erase the past would never be entirely successful. Even as the cremation fires burned in forests across Eastern Europe, fragments of the story began to escape the control of those who had ordered the operation, carried forward through whispers, rumors, and the determination of individuals who understood that what they had seen should not remain hidden forever. Chapter 5, Segment 3. Destroying the Landscape of Evidence. As the work of Action 1005 continued across the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, the SS leadership recognized that destroying the bodies buried in mass graves was only part of the larger objective of concealing the earlier massacres, because even after the remains had been burned, there still existed visible traces in the landscape that could reveal what had taken place at those locations. The burial pits created during the mass shootings of 1941 and 1942 had often been large trenches carved into the ground with the specific purpose of holding hundreds or even thousands of bodies. And once the exhumation and cremation processes were completed, these pits remained as disturbed areas of soil that could still raise suspicion if discovered later. For this reason, the operational teams responsible for Action 1005 were instructed not only to destroy the bodies but also to alter the physical appearance of the sites themselves so that they would blend into the surrounding terrain and appear as ordinary parts of the natural landscape. This effort to reshape the environment became a significant stage of the operation and demonstrated how carefully the SS attempted to erase the traces of the crimes committed during the earlier phase of the Holocaust. Once the cremation fires had burned down and the ashes had cooled, prisoners were ordered to collect the remaining fragments of bone and crush them into smaller pieces using heavy tools or improvised grinding devices. These crushed remains were then scattered across the ground or buried again in shallow pits that were difficult to detect. In some cases, the ashes were mixed with soil so that they would disperse naturally over time and become indistinguishable from the surrounding earth. After this stage had been completed, the labor detachments began the process of leveling the ground where the burial pits had existed. Soil that had been removed during the excavation was pushed back into the area, and additional earth was sometimes brought in to fill depressions or smooth, uneven surfaces created by the earlier graves. The objective was to eliminate any visible signs that the land had once been disturbed. This work required careful attention because the SS officers overseeing the operation understood that investigators might later examine these areas closely if the graves were suspected to exist there. The prisoners therefore spent long hours moving soil, flattening the ground, and restoring the shape of the terrain as much as possible. In wooded areas, the process often continued with the planting of trees or the spreading of leaves and forest debris across the surface so that the site would resemble the surrounding woodland floor. In open fields, grass seed might be scattered over the leveled ground so that vegetation would grow and gradually conceal the earlier disturbance. Through these measures, the SS attempted to transform former killing grounds into landscapes that appeared ordinary and untouched. This stage of the operation required patience and labor because the changes needed to appear natural rather than artificial. Guards supervising the work sometimes ordered prisoners to return repeatedly to certain areas to adjust the surface of the ground until it matched the surrounding terrain. The effort to reshape the landscape also extended beyond the burial pits themselves. Temporary structures that had been constructed during the exhumation process, including the cremation platforms made from railway tracks and wooden supports, were dismantled once the burning was completed. Some materials were transported away for use at other sites while others were destroyed or abandoned. The goal was to ensure that little remained to suggest that a large operation had once taken place there. In certain locations, paths leading to the graves were erased or covered with branches so that the approach routes used by the SS teams would not be visible. Even the temporary barracks or shelters used to house prisoner labor detachments were removed or destroyed before the operational units departed. By the time an Action 1005 team left a particular site, the aim was to leave behind a landscape that offered no obvious indication of the violence that had occurred there. Yet, despite the careful attention devoted to these efforts, the process could never completely erase the history embedded within the soil. The ground in many places had been disturbed on such a large scale that subtle differences remained visible to those who knew where to look, and over time weather, erosion, or natural growth sometimes revealed fragments of bone or other traces that had not been fully destroyed. Moreover, the attempt to conceal the graves could not eliminate the memories of the people who had witnessed the earlier massacres or the later efforts to reopen them. Local residents who had seen the burial pits being dug during the shootings, or who later observed the smoke rising from cremation fires in nearby forests, retained knowledge of these locations even after the physical evidence had been altered. For the SS leadership, however, the priority was not to create perfect invisibility but to make discovery as difficult as possible. If investigators arriving years later encountered a landscape that appeared undisturbed, the chances of uncovering the graves without precise information would be greatly reduced. The work of leveling the ground, scattering ashes, planting vegetation, and dismantling temporary structures therefore formed the final stage of the systematic effort to remove the physical traces of mass murder from the countryside of Eastern Europe. Through these actions, the SS attempted to reshape the geography of the Holocaust itself, transforming places that had once been unmistakable burial sites into landscapes that seemed silent and ordinary, as though the events that had taken place there had never occurred. Yet beneath that surface the memory of those crimes remained, preserved not in the ground alone but in the testimonies of survivors and witnesses who would later reveal the truth that the operation had tried so carefully to hide. Chapter 6, Segment 1. The War Turns and the Urgency of Erasing the Past. By the middle years of the Second World War, the operation known as Action 1005 began unfolding within a rapidly changing military environment, and the urgency behind the program became closely connected to the shifting balance of the war itself. During the early months of the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Nazi leadership had expected a swift and decisive victory that would secure permanent German control over vast regions of Eastern Europe. Under those initial assumptions, the burial pits created during the mass shootings of Jewish communities and other targeted groups were not regarded as immediate problems by the SS authorities who organized the killings. These graves, scattered across forests, ravines, and fields throughout occupied territories, were believed to be permanent resting places that would remain hidden within lands the German regime expected to control indefinitely. However, the war did not unfold according to those expectations. As the conflict stretched into 1942 and 1943, the German military began facing increasing resistance from Soviet forces. Major battles such as Stalingrad marked turning points that signaled a gradual shift in momentum on the Eastern Front. Instead of advancing deeper into Soviet territory, German armies were forced into defensive positions and, in some areas, began retreating from regions they had previously occupied. Within the SS leadership, these developments created a growing concern that the graves left behind by the mass shootings might eventually be discovered if German forces lost control of the territory where they were located. The burial sites were not isolated incidents, but rather the physical remains of an enormous campaign of violence carried out across hundreds of towns and villages. If Soviet troops or international investigators were to uncover these graves intact, they would provide undeniable evidence of the scale and systematic nature of the killings. It was within this context that the operation to remove the bodies and destroy the graves gained increasing urgency. Action 1005 was therefore not simply an attempt to conceal crimes after they had been committed, but also a reaction to the realization that the war itself might expose those crimes if the physical evidence remained in place. The advancing front lines created a sense of pressure within the SS command structure responsible for the operation. Teams tasked with reopening graves and burning bodies had to move quickly through regions where the military situation was becoming increasingly unstable. In some areas, the operational units arrived only months before Soviet forces began pushing toward the same territory. This meant that the work of exhumation, cremation, and landscape alteration had to be completed as rapidly as possible before the opportunity to reach the sites disappeared entirely. The pressure to accelerate the operation affected nearly every aspect of its implementation. Prisoners forced into labor detachments were made to work longer hours digging into burial pits and carrying bodies to cremation structures. Fires burned continuously in forests where railway track platforms had been constructed to reduce the remains to ash. Guards pushed the labor groups to maintain an unbroken rhythm of work so that graves could be cleared quickly and the operational teams could move on to the next location before retreating German forces lost control of the region. This sense of urgency also influenced how the SS selected which burial sites would be addressed first. Priority was often given to locations where the earlier massacres had been especially large or where military developments suggested that Soviet troops might soon reach the area. In these places, the destruction of evidence became a race against time. While the operational teams worked to reopen graves and burn bodies, the sounds of distant artillery or the movement of military convoys sometimes reminded those present that the front lines were drawing closer. The war, which had once seemed to guarantee permanent German domination of the region, now threatened to expose the very crimes that the SS leadership was attempting to hide. For the prisoners forced to carry out the labor, this atmosphere created an additional layer of tension. Many of them were aware that the war was changing and that German forces were retreating in some areas. Rumors circulated among the labor detachments that Soviet armies might eventually reach the regions where they were working. These rumors sometimes gave prisoners a small measure of hope that the conflict might end before they were killed. Although the SS guards supervising the operation maintained strict control and often responded harshly to any sign of resistance or hesitation. Despite these harsh conditions, the possibility that the war might soon bring an end to the operation lingered in the background of the labor camps and temporary work sites established near the graves. Meanwhile, the SS personnel responsible for Action 1005 faced their own challenges as the military situation deteriorated. Transporting equipment, fuel, and materials for cremation structures became more difficult as supply lines were strained by the shifting front. In some regions, operational teams were forced to abandon planned exhumations because German troops had already begun withdrawing from the area. These unfinished sites remained as silent reminders that the effort to erase the evidence of the Holocaust could never fully keep pace with the changing course of the war. Even so, the determination to continue the operation remained strong among the SS leadership. Orders continued to circulate directing teams to reopen as many graves as possible before the advancing armies made further work impossible. The urgency surrounding Action 1005 therefore reflected a broader awareness within the Nazi regime that the crimes of the Holocaust might one day be judged by the outside world. By destroying the bodies buried in mass graves and altering the landscapes where those graves had existed, the SS hoped to eliminate the most visible proof of what had taken place during the early years of the war. Yet the very urgency with which the operation was carried out also revealed the fear that the truth might eventually emerge despite these efforts. As the war continued to shift against Germany, the operation to erase the past unfolded under the shadow of approaching armies and the growing realization that time itself was becoming an enemy of those attempting to conceal the evidence of mass murder. Chapter 6, Segment 2. Retreating Front Lines and the Race Against Discovery. As the war progressed deeper into 1943 and 1944, the military situation on the Eastern Front continued to deteriorate for Nazi Germany, and this changing strategic landscape directly influenced the pace and direction of Action 1005. What had originally begun as a carefully organized effort to reopen mass graves and destroy their contents gradually transformed into a desperate race against advancing Soviet forces. Each shift in the front lines meant that entire regions once securely controlled by German occupation authorities could soon fall back under Soviet control, bringing with them the risk that the graves left behind by the earlier mass shootings might be uncovered by investigators or soldiers entering those areas. The leadership of the SS, already aware of the immense number of burial sites scattered across Eastern Europe, recognized that it would be impossible to eliminate every grave before the war moved beyond their reach. Yet the pressure to destroy as much evidence as possible before losing territory intensified as Soviet offensives pushed steadily westward. Operational teams responsible for Action 1005 therefore found themselves working under increasingly unstable conditions. In regions of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic territories, the sounds of distant battles or the movement of military convoys often served as reminders that the front was approaching. The work of reopening graves and burning bodies continued even as German military units prepared defensive positions or began withdrawing from nearby areas. This overlap between military retreat and evidence destruction created an atmosphere of urgency within the operational units. Orders were frequently issued to accelerate the work, pushing prisoners and guards alike to complete exhumations in the shortest possible time. Fires burned continuously in forest clearings where cremation platforms had been constructed, and labor detachments were forced to maintain a relentless pace, lifting bodies from burial pits and stacking them onto the burning structures until the graves were emptied. In many locations, the process continued day and night, with guards ensuring that prisoners remained at their tasks, regardless of exhaustion or weather conditions. The SS leadership believed that even partial destruction of burial sites would make it more difficult for future investigators to determine the scale of the earlier massacres. If bodies could be burned and ashes scattered, the most visible proof of the crimes would vanish even if some traces of disturbed ground remained behind. However, the rapid movement of the front lines often disrupted these plans. In certain areas, operational teams arrived at execution sites only to discover that the military situation made it impossible to remain long enough to complete the work. Sometimes graves were opened and bodies partially exhumed before the teams were ordered to withdraw due to the proximity of Soviet forces. In other cases, the sites were never reached at all because German troops had already retreated from the region before Action 1005 units could arrive. These unfinished operations meant that many burial pits remained intact across the landscape, waiting to be discovered when the territories were liberated. The pressure of the advancing war also created logistical challenges for the teams conducting the operation. Transportation of equipment such as railway tracks used for cremation platforms became more difficult as rail networks were disrupted by military damage or partisan attacks. Supplies of fuel and tools were not always reliable, forcing operational units to improvise with whatever materials could be gathered locally. Despite these obstacles, the SS continued to push the operation forward wherever possible, directing teams to prioritize areas where the largest massacres had taken place or where Soviet troops were expected to arrive soon. For the prisoners forced into labor detachments, the approaching front sometimes brought a mixture of fear and hope. On one hand, the presence of nearby battles increased the risk of chaotic conditions in which guards might execute prisoners to prevent escapes before abandoning the site. On the other hand, rumors occasionally spread among the laborers that liberation might arrive before their own executions were carried out. Some prisoners attempted to use the confusion of military retreat as an opportunity to escape into nearby forests or reach partisan groups operating in the region. These attempts were extremely dangerous and rarely successful, yet they demonstrated the desperation and determination of those trapped within the system of forced labor that sustained Action 1005. Meanwhile, the SS guards supervising the work remained aware that time was working against them. Every kilometer that the Soviet army advanced reduced the number of graves that could be destroyed before German authority collapsed in the region. This realization intensified the effort to conceal as much evidence as possible before abandoning each site. When operational teams prepared to withdraw from a location, they often hurried to complete the final stages of the process by leveling the ground where burial pits had existed and scattering the ashes left behind from the cremation fires. Temporary structures were dismantled or destroyed so that little visible trace remained of the operation. The aim was to leave behind a landscape that would reveal as little as possible to anyone arriving after the German retreat. Yet, despite these efforts, the advancing front ensured that many places where mass shootings had occurred would soon fall into Soviet hands without the graves being fully destroyed. When Red Army units later entered these regions, they encountered burial pits that still contained bodies or partially burned remains, providing direct evidence of the atrocities committed during the occupation. Investigators and journalists who followed the advancing troops documented these sites, recording details that would later become crucial in post-war trials of Nazi officials. The race against discovery that had driven Action 1005 therefore ended in partial failure. While the operation succeeded in destroying evidence at many locations, the speed of the Soviet advance ensured that countless graves remained untouched or only partially concealed. The shifting front lines of the war ultimately placed limits on how far the SS could carry out their effort to erase the traces of mass murder from the landscape of Eastern Europe. As German forces continued to retreat westward, the operation that had once been designed to conceal the crimes of the Holocaust found itself overtaken by the very war that had created those crimes in the first place. Chapter 6, Segment 3. Abandoned Graves and the Evidence Left Behind. As the war on the Eastern Front continued to turn against Nazi Germany during the later stages of 1943 and into 1944, The operation known as Action 1005 increasingly confronted a reality that the SS leadership had tried to avoid from the beginning. The advancing Soviet armies were moving too quickly and across too many regions for the systematic destruction of all mass graves to be completed before German forces lost control of the territories where the killings had taken place. The plan to erase the physical traces of the early Holocaust had assumed that operational teams would have sufficient time to locate burial sites, exhume the bodies, burn the remains, and alter the landscape so that the graves would no longer be visible. Yet the vast scale of the earlier massacres meant that burial pits existed across thousands of locations scattered throughout forests, fields, ravines, and rural outskirts of towns stretching across Eastern Europe. Even with multiple units working simultaneously, the SS could only reach a portion of these sites before the front lines shifted once again and German forces were forced to withdraw. As Soviet offensives gathered strength, entire regions changed hands within weeks or even days, leaving behind areas where Action 1005 teams had either not yet arrived or had only begun their work before being ordered to retreat. In some places graves had already been opened, but the cremation process had not yet been completed, leaving partially burned remains and disturbed earth that clearly indicated what had occurred there. In other locations, the burial pits remained untouched, still containing the bodies of victims who had been executed months or years earlier during the mass shootings of 1941 and 1942. When Soviet soldiers and investigators entered these areas after the German retreat, they encountered scenes that revealed the scale of the earlier massacres despite the efforts made to conceal them. Reports written by Soviet investigative commissions described burial pits filled with bodies or with layers of remains that had only partially decomposed. These discoveries often took place in forests where the ground appeared uneven or where local residents had already pointed out the places where executions had been carried out during the occupation. In several regions, villagers guided investigators to sites where they had witnessed the mass shootings or where they had later seen smoke rising from cremation fires during the time when Action 1005 teams were active nearby. The presence of such witnesses meant that even when the SS had attempted to level the ground or scatter ashes after burning bodies, the memory of the events remained embedded within local communities. As investigators began opening the graves, they uncovered evidence that confirmed the stories told by survivors and residents. Layers of clothing, personal belongings, and skeletal remains revealed that the victims had been buried in large groups after being shot. In certain places, investigators also discovered traces of cremation platforms constructed from railway tracks or other materials, remnants of the efforts made by the SS to destroy the bodies before abandoning the site. These discoveries became some of the earliest documented evidence of the mass shootings that had occurred across Eastern Europe during the first phase of the Holocaust. Photographs, reports, and testimonies collected during these investigations were later used in post-war trials to demonstrate the systematic nature of the killings and the subsequent attempts to conceal them. For the SS leadership, the incomplete destruction of the graves represented a failure of the broader plan to eliminate the most visible proof of the crimes committed during the occupation. Yet the scale of the earlier massacres and the speed of the Soviet advance had made it impossible to achieve the goal of total concealment. Action 1005 had succeeded in destroying many burial sites, but countless others remained intact or only partially altered. The graves that were left behind became silent witnesses to what had taken place in those landscapes. As the war continued and German forces retreated further west, the opportunity to reopen and burn additional graves disappeared entirely in many regions. Operational teams that had once traveled from site to site dismantling evidence were now forced to abandon their work and move back toward territories still under German control. The prisoners who had been used as labor detachments in the operation often faced grim outcomes during these retreats, as SS guards frequently executed them before leaving the area to prevent them from falling into enemy hands and revealing details of the operation. Yet even this brutal measure could not fully erase the knowledge of what had occurred. A small number of prisoners managed to escape or survive long enough to provide testimony after the war ended. describing the process of exhuming graves and burning bodies under the supervision of SS personnel. Their accounts later became crucial sources of information about Action 1005, helping historians reconstruct how the operation had been carried out and why it had been ordered in the first place. The abandoned graves discovered by investigators and the testimonies of survivors together demonstrated that the attempt to erase the evidence of the Holocaust had ultimately failed to achieve its intended purpose. While many bodies had been burned and many sites altered, enough traces remained in the soil and in human memory to reveal the truth about the massacres. The landscapes of Eastern Europe still held the marks of those crimes, and as the war drew closer to its conclusion, the effort to hide them gradually gave way to the process of documenting and understanding what had happened there. Chapter 7, Segment 1. Prisoner resistance within the Action 1005 labor detachments. Within the grim structure of Action 1005, where prisoners were forced to exhume mass graves and burn the bodies of victims in an effort to erase the physical evidence of the Holocaust, there also existed moments of resistance that revealed the determination of some prisoners to challenge the system that controlled them, even under circumstances where the risks were overwhelming and the chances of survival were extremely small. The men forced into these labor detachments understood very clearly the situation in which they found themselves. Unlike many other forms of forced labor within the Nazi camp system, the work connected to Action 1005 placed prisoners in direct contact with the evidence of mass murder. As they dug into burial pits, lifted bodies from the earth, and stacked them onto cremation platforms built from railway tracks and wood, they were confronted daily with the remains of people who had been executed during earlier phases of the Holocaust. Many recognized clothing, religious items, or personal belongings belonging to members of their own communities. This knowledge created a painful awareness that the labor they were being forced to perform was part of a broader attempt by the SS to erase the truth of the massacres. At the same time, prisoners also understood another brutal reality. The SS guards supervising the operation had no intention of allowing them to survive once their work was completed. Because these labor detachments possessed direct knowledge of the reopening of graves and the destruction of bodies, they were considered dangerous witnesses. In many locations, prisoners who had carried out the work at one burial site were executed before the operational teams moved on to the next location. This pattern was widely understood among the prisoners themselves. Word spread quickly within the temporary camps and guarded work sites that the completion of the task often meant death for those who had performed it. This realization created an atmosphere in which some prisoners began considering desperate forms of resistance. Their options were limited. The work sites were heavily guarded by SS personnel and police units who carried weapons and maintained strict control over the movements of the labor detachments. The forests where many of the graves were located were often remote, making escape difficult without knowledge of the surrounding terrain. Yet, even within these conditions, the possibility of resistance persisted. In some cases, prisoners attempted to sabotage the work itself by slowing their pace or damaging equipment used during the cremation process. Such acts of defiance were extremely dangerous, as guards responded harshly to any sign that the prisoners were not carrying out orders with the expected speed and efficiency. Punishments could include beatings, reduced rations, or immediate execution. Despite this risk, small acts of resistance occurred when prisoners attempted to delay the operation in the hope that advancing Soviet forces might reach the area before the work was completed. Other forms of resistance involved attempts to escape from the work sites. During the long hours spent in forests or rural landscapes, prisoners occasionally searched for moments when guards were distracted or when darkness might provide cover for flight. A few managed to slip away into the surrounding woods, hoping to reach partisan groups that operated in many parts of Eastern Europe. These escapes were rare and often unsuccessful, as guards quickly organized searches when a prisoner was missing. Yet some individuals did manage to evade capture and survive long enough to provide testimony after the war. Their accounts later became valuable sources of information about how Action 1005 operated and how prisoners were forced to participate in the destruction of evidence. In certain instances, resistance took the form of organized planning among prisoners who hoped to launch coordinated escapes or uprisings. These plans were extremely difficult to carry out because the labor detachments were constantly monitored and communication between prisoners was limited by the fear that informers or collaborators might report suspicious activity to the guards. Nevertheless, the shared understanding that execution often followed the completion of the work created a powerful motivation for some prisoners to attempt collective action. Even when such plans failed or were discovered before they could be carried out, they demonstrated the determination of individuals trapped within the operation to resist their role in it. The presence of resistance within Action 1005 also highlights an important aspect of the Holocaust that is sometimes overshadowed by the overwhelming scale of the violence itself. The victims of Nazi persecution were not passive participants in their fate. Even within systems designed to eliminate hope and suppress opposition, individuals and groups searched for ways to assert their humanity and challenge the authority of those who controlled them. In the context of Action 1005, resistance often took the form of small acts carried out under extreme pressure rather than large organized revolts. Yet these actions were significant because they revealed the courage of people who understood that the system they were confronting had been built to deny them any chance of survival. As the operation continued across Eastern Europe, the presence of such resistance remained a constant concern for the SS guards supervising the labor detachments. The possibility that prisoners might escape and reveal the details of the operation reinforced the leadership's decision to eliminate witnesses once the work at a site had been completed. Despite these efforts to maintain control, the fact that some prisoners survived ensured that the history of Action 1005 would eventually become known. Their testimonies, combined with the physical evidence discovered at abandoned graves, helped reconstruct the story of an operation designed to erase the traces of mass murder from the landscape. In this way, the resistance of prisoners within Action 1005 contributed not only to acts of defiance during the war, but also to the preservation of historical truth in the years that followed. Chapter 7, Segment 2: Escapes and the First Testimonies of the Operation. Although the system of control surrounding Action 1005 was designed to prevent witnesses from surviving, the reality of war and the determination of certain prisoners meant that a small number of individuals managed to escape the labor detachments and later provide some of the earliest testimonies about the operation. And these accounts became extremely important in helping investigators and historians understand how the SS attempted to destroy the evidence of the Holocaust during the later years of the conflict. The labor detachments used within Action 1005 were usually composed of prisoners who had been transported under guard from ghettos, labor camps, or concentration camps located in nearby regions. Once they arrived at execution sites where graves were being reopened, they were placed under constant surveillance by SS guards who understood that these men possessed knowledge that could expose the crimes the operation was meant to conceal. Because of this, the SS command structure typically intended that the prisoners would not survive once their assigned work had been completed. After burial pits had been emptied and bodies burned on the cremation platforms constructed near the site, labor detachments were often executed so that they could not later testify about what had occurred. Despite this system of control, the very nature of the operation created moments when the guards could not maintain perfect oversight. Work sites were often located in forests or rural landscapes, where prisoners were required to move between burial pits, wood piles, and cremation structures throughout the day. At times, these movements created brief opportunities when the attention of guards might shift toward other tasks, allowing a determined individual to attempt an escape. Some prisoners waited for darkness, hoping that the cover of night would allow them to slip beyond the perimeter established around the work area. Others attempted to flee during the chaos that sometimes accompanied the arrival or departure of operational teams moving between locations. The risk involved in such attempts was enormous. Guards were armed and instructed to shoot prisoners who tried to escape, and the surrounding forests were unfamiliar terrain for many of the laborers who had been transported from distant regions. Even if a prisoner managed to evade immediate capture, survival required finding food, avoiding patrols, and reaching either sympathetic civilians or partisan groups operating in the countryside. Yet, despite these obstacles, a small number of prisoners succeeded in escaping the labor detachments connected to Action 1005. Some of these individuals later reached partisan units that were active in many areas of Eastern Europe, particularly in forests where resistance groups operated against German occupation forces. Partisans sometimes provided shelter, food, or assistance to escapees who brought with them stories about the reopening of graves and the burning of bodies in remote clearings. These accounts were among the first indications that German authorities were attempting to eliminate the physical evidence of earlier massacres. In certain cases, escaped prisoners were able to pass information to Soviet intelligence or local underground networks that documented German activities during the occupation. Although the full scope of Action 1005 was not widely understood until after the war, these early testimonies created fragments of knowledge that later investigators could piece together when the conflict ended. The experiences described by escapees were often consistent despite the different regions in which they had been forced to work. They spoke of burial pits being reopened with shovels and tools, of decomposed bodies lifted from the earth, and of cremation platforms built from railway tracks where the remains were burned continuously until little was left but ash and fragments of bone. Many described the constant fear that they would be executed once the work was finished, a fear that often motivated the decision to attempt escape despite the dangers involved. Some survivors later recalled how prisoners secretly discussed the possibility of fleeing or passing information about the operation to anyone who might be able to report it beyond the boundaries of German control. The SS guards supervising the labor detachments were aware that such escapes could threaten the secrecy of the operation, and when prisoners disappeared, the response was usually immediate and severe. Search parties were organized to track escapees through the surrounding forests, and other prisoners were sometimes punished in retaliation. These reactions were intended to discourage further escape attempts and maintain the atmosphere of fear that kept the labor detachments under control. Yet the fact that some individuals succeeded in escaping demonstrated that even the strict security surrounding Action 1005 could not entirely prevent witnesses from surviving. The importance of these escapes became clearer after the war ended. When investigators began examining burial sites and collecting testimonies about the Holocaust, the accounts provided by former prisoners who had worked within Action 1005 offered direct insight into an operation that had been designed to leave as little evidence behind as possible. Survivors described the structure of the cremation platforms, the methods used to crush bone fragments after burning, and the procedures by which the SS attempted to level the ground and conceal the former burial pits. Their memories helped reconstruct the sequence of events that had taken place in forests and remote areas where the exhumations had occurred. These testimonies also revealed the broader purpose of the operation, not merely the destruction of bodies, but the deliberate attempt to erase the physical record of the mass shootings that had occurred earlier in the war. The survival of even a small number of witnesses therefore undermined the central goal of Action 1005. While the SS had succeeded in destroying many burial sites, the stories carried by escapees ensured that the history of the operation would eventually become known. Their accounts, combined with the evidence uncovered at abandoned graves when Soviet forces liberated the territories, formed a crucial part of the documentation used in post-war trials of Nazi officials. Through these testimonies, the world learned about the effort to conceal the Holocaust by reopening graves and burning the remains of victims, revealing how far the Nazi regime had been willing to go in its attempt to hide the crimes it had committed. Chapter 7, Segment 3. Memory Against Erasure. As the operation known as Action 1005 continued across Eastern Europe, the SS leadership believed that by reopening graves, burning bodies, and altering the landscapes where massacres had taken place. They could gradually erase the physical traces of the Holocaust's earlier phase. Yet what they could not fully control was the persistence of memory among those who had witnessed the events, and it was this human memory, held by prisoners, local residents, survivors, and even some reluctant observers, that ultimately prevented the operation from achieving its intended goal of complete historical erasure. The landscapes where mass shootings had occurred were rarely empty places before the killings began. Many were located near villages, towns, or rural communities where people had lived for generations, and where the sudden appearance of German units conducting executions had left a deep impression on those who saw or heard what happened. Residents sometimes watched from hidden vantage points as groups of men, women, and children were marched toward forests or ravines and never returned. Others heard gunfire echoing through the countryside for hours or noticed the movement of trucks carrying victims to execution sites outside their towns. After the killings ended, these same residents often knew the locations where the burial pits had been dug, even if they were forced to remain silent under the threat of German punishment. When Action 1005 teams later arrived to reopen those graves, the renewed activity in these places attracted attention once again. Forests that had been quiet for months suddenly became restricted zones guarded by armed personnel, and smoke from large cremation fires sometimes rose above the treetops for days at a time. Even when people did not witness the work directly, the changes in the landscape and the unusual presence of German units reinforced the knowledge that something connected to the earlier killings was being disturbed. In many communities, the memory of what had occurred remained strong despite the efforts of the occupation authorities to suppress discussion. For prisoners forced to participate in the labor detachments of Action 1005, memory played an equally powerful role. These men were compelled to dig into burial pits and handle the remains of victims whose lives had been taken during earlier massacres, and in doing so they confronted evidence that the SS leadership hoped would disappear once the cremation fires had burned away the bodies. Many prisoners recognized elements of their own communities among the remains, items of clothing, religious objects, or personal belongings that revealed the identity of those who had been buried there. This recognition reinforced the emotional weight of the work and strengthened the determination among some prisoners to resist the idea that the evidence of these crimes could simply vanish. Even when they were unable to stop the destruction of the graves themselves, prisoners understood that remembering what they had seen might one day allow the truth to be revealed. This belief became particularly important for those who managed to escape or survive long enough to share their experiences after the war. Their testimonies formed a bridge between the physical destruction of evidence and the historical record that would later document the crimes of the Holocaust. Through these accounts, investigators learned how the cremation platforms were constructed, how prisoners were forced to exhume bodies, and how the SS attempted to scatter ashes and reshape the ground to conceal the former burial pits. Without the memories carried by these witnesses, the effort to reconstruct the history of Action 1005 would have been far more difficult. Memory also survived among the local populations who had lived near the execution sites. In the months and years after German forces retreated from these regions, villagers often guided investigators to places in forests or fields where they knew burial pits had once existed. Some described the original mass shootings they had witnessed during the occupation, while others spoke about the later arrival of SS units that reopened the graves and burned the bodies. These recollections helped identify locations that might otherwise have remained hidden beneath leveled ground or newly planted vegetation. When investigators opened the soil in these places, they sometimes discovered fragments of bone, clothing, or other traces that confirmed the accounts of the witnesses. The presence of such memories demonstrated that even the most determined effort to alter the landscape could not fully erase the knowledge carried by those who had lived through the events. The persistence of memory, therefore, became one of the most significant obstacles to the success of Action 1005. The SS leadership had assumed that by destroying bodies and eliminating prisoner witnesses, they could remove the most direct evidence of the earlier massacres. Yet they underestimated the ability of human communities to remember what had happened in their surroundings. Each execution site existed within a broader social environment where people had seen, heard, or later suspected the violence that had taken place there. When these individuals shared their experiences after the war, they contributed to a collective record that no attempt at physical concealment could fully suppress. In the years following the conflict, historians, investigators, and survivors worked together to document these memories and connect them with the physical evidence discovered at former execution sites. Through this process, the history of Action 1005 emerged not as a successful effort to erase the past, but as an example of how the perpetrators of mass violence attempted, and ultimately failed, to eliminate the traces of their crimes. The graves that were reopened and burned during the operation no longer contained the bodies of the victims, but the memory of those victims remained preserved in the testimonies of witnesses and the historical record created from their accounts. In this way, the attempt to destroy the evidence of the Holocaust encountered a powerful counterforce: the determination of people to remember and to speak about what they had seen, ensuring that the truth would survive even after the landscapes where those crimes occurred had been deliberately altered. Chapter 8, Segment 1. The End of Action 1005 and the Collapse of the Operation. By the final stages of the Second World War, the operation known as Action 1005 began to lose the structure and reach that had once allowed it to function as a coordinated effort across the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, and the collapse of the operation was closely tied to the broader collapse of German control in those same regions as the advancing Soviet armies pushed steadily westward. During the earlier years of the operation, SS teams had moved from site to site, reopening burial pits and burning bodies in an attempt to remove the evidence of the mass shootings carried out during the first phase of the Holocaust. These teams worked under the authority of the SS security apparatus and followed instructions that emphasized secrecy, speed, and the elimination of witnesses once the work had been completed. Yet, as the war continued to shift against Germany, the conditions that had once allowed the operation to function began to disappear. Military defeats on the Eastern Front forced German units to retreat from large sections of territory where execution sites were located, and the rapid movement of the front lines made it increasingly difficult for Action 1005 teams to travel between locations or maintain the guarded work zones that had been used to reopen graves in earlier stages of the operation. In many areas, the SS units responsible for the program found themselves working under the constant pressure of approaching Soviet forces. Operational teams were often forced to abandon sites before the process of exhumation and cremation had been fully completed, leaving behind partially burned remains or burial pits that had only begun to be reopened. These unfinished operations revealed the limits of the SS attempt to erase the evidence of mass murder. Even though thousands of bodies had been destroyed through the cremation process, the sheer scale of the earlier massacres meant that countless graves remained scattered across forests and fields throughout Eastern Europe. As German authority over these regions weakened, the ability to conceal those graves weakened as well. The collapse of the operation also reflected growing logistical difficulties faced by the SS units involved. Transportation networks that had once allowed equipment and personnel to move relatively easily across the occupied territories were increasingly disrupted by military damage, partisan attacks, and the general chaos created by retreating armies. Railway lines were damaged or abandoned, roads became crowded with military convoys and refugees, and supply chains that had previously delivered materials for cremation platforms or fuel for the fires became unreliable. Without these logistical supports, it became harder for operational teams to construct the cremation structures that had been essential to the process of destroying bodies. In addition, the SS personnel assigned to Action 1005 were sometimes reassigned to other military or security duties as the situation on the front demanded additional manpower. These changes gradually reduced the number of teams available to continue the work. As the war moved closer to German territory itself, the priorities of the Nazi leadership shifted toward defensive efforts aimed at slowing the advance of Allied forces. In this new context, the operation to erase the graves of earlier massacres no longer held the same level of strategic importance it once had. Even so, the desire to conceal evidence of the Holocaust did not disappear entirely. In certain locations, SS units continued to carry out exhumations and cremations whenever time and resources allowed, particularly at sites where earlier massacres had been especially large or where the burial pits were widely known among local populations. These final efforts often took place under chaotic conditions. Guards rushed prisoners through the work of digging and burning remains, aware that the opportunity to complete the operation might disappear within days if enemy forces reached the area. Cremation fires burned rapidly as bodies were stacked in large numbers on the platforms constructed from railway tracks and wood. And once the flames died down, the SS personnel supervising the operation attempted to level the ground and scatter the ashes before withdrawing. Yet these hurried efforts rarely achieved the level of concealment that had been possible during earlier phases of the operation. In many cases, the graves remained clearly visible or only partially altered, leaving behind evidence that would later be discovered by investigators. The collapse of Action 1005 also affected the prisoners who had been forced to carry out the labor connected to the operation. As German units retreated from various regions, the fate of these labor detachments often became uncertain. In some instances, prisoners were executed before the SS teams abandoned a site in order to prevent them from falling into enemy hands and revealing what had taken place there. In other situations, the chaos of retreat created opportunities for prisoners to escape into nearby forests or reach villages where they could hide until the arrival of Soviet forces. A small number of these individuals survived and later provided testimony describing the reopening of graves and the destruction of bodies they had witnessed during the operation. Their accounts became crucial pieces of evidence when the history of Action 1005 was reconstructed after the war. By the time German forces had retreated across much of Eastern Europe, the operation designed to erase the physical traces of the Holocaust had largely come to an end. The front lines had moved too far and too quickly for the SS to continue the systematic destruction of burial sites. What remained behind was a landscape that bore both the marks of the original massacres and the later attempts to conceal them. Some graves had been emptied and burned, while others remained untouched or only partially altered. Investigators entering these regions in the final months of the war encountered a complex record of both violence and concealment. The collapse of Action 1005 therefore revealed the limits of the Nazi effort to erase its own crimes. Despite years of work aimed at destroying evidence, enough traces remained in the soil, in abandoned cremation sites, and in the memories of witnesses to ensure that the history of the massacres could not be completely hidden. Chapter 8, Segment 2. Discovery by the Advancing Armies. As the front lines of the war shifted rapidly during 1944 and into the final months of the conflict, large portions of Eastern Europe that had once been under German occupation began to fall back into the hands of Soviet forces, and with the arrival of these advancing armies came the first large-scale discoveries of burial sites that revealed the extent of the earlier mass shootings and the later attempts to destroy evidence through operations such as Action 1005. When Soviet troops entered towns and rural areas that had been occupied for several years, they encountered landscapes that still bore traces of the violence carried out during the German presence. In forests, ravines, and fields surrounding many settlements, there were places where the ground appeared disturbed or uneven, locations that local residents sometimes pointed out as sites where groups of victims had been taken during the occupation and never returned. In some of these places, investigators found burial pits that had not been touched by Action 1005 teams before the German retreat, graves that still contained the bodies of victims who had been shot during the early phase of the Holocaust. These sites provided direct physical evidence of the massacres that had taken place between 1941 and 1942 when Einsatzgruppen units and other German security formations followed the invading army through Eastern Europe, carrying out systematic executions. At other locations, the investigators encountered burial sites that had clearly been disturbed more recently. The soil had been opened and then leveled again, and nearby there were signs that fires had burned intensely for long periods. Remains of railway tracks or metal fragments sometimes lay scattered on the ground, suggesting that cremation platforms had once been constructed there. In such places, the burial pits had been reopened and bodies removed, leaving behind only ashes or small fragments of bone mixed into the soil. These discoveries provided the first clear indications that the German authorities had attempted to conceal the earlier massacres by destroying the remains of the victims. Soviet investigative commissions were soon organized to document these sites and collect evidence about what had occurred during the occupation. Teams of medical experts, forensic specialists, and military officials traveled to locations where graves had been reported. In areas where burial pits remained intact, investigators carefully opened the ground and recorded the layers of bodies they found within the trenches. Clothing, personal belongings, and bullet casings were often recovered alongside the remains, helping to reconstruct how the executions had been carried out. Witnesses from nearby villages were also interviewed, and many described the events they had observed during the years of occupation. Some had seen groups of Jewish residents or other prisoners being marched toward forests where gunfire was later heard. Others recalled the arrival of German units that had reopened the graves months or years after the shootings, forcing prisoners to dig up the bodies and burn them in large fires that filled the air with smoke. These testimonies provided crucial context for the physical evidence discovered at the sites. They confirmed that the disturbed graves and cremation areas were connected to an organized effort to eliminate the remains of victims from earlier massacres. Photographs were taken to document both intact burial pits and sites where the ground had been leveled after cremation. Reports describing the discoveries were compiled and later used in investigations into Nazi crimes. The discovery of these sites shocked many of the soldiers and officials who first encountered them. While rumors of mass killings had circulated during the war, the physical evidence uncovered in these forests and fields revealed the enormous scale of the violence that had occurred during the German occupation. Some burial pits contained hundreds or even thousands of bodies arranged in layers that showed how victims had been forced to lie or stand in groups before being shot. In areas where Action 1005 had partially destroyed the evidence, investigators still found traces that indicated what had happened. Ash mixed with soil, fragments of bone, and the remains of cremation structures all pointed toward the deliberate attempt to erase the physical proof of earlier massacres. These discoveries began to form part of a larger body of evidence documenting the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. As Soviet forces continued advancing westward, they encountered similar sites in region after region, each one revealing another chapter in the history of mass shootings and subsequent efforts to conceal them. Investigators realized that the pattern of disturbed graves and cremation areas was not accidental but rather part of a coordinated operation carried out by the SS to destroy the bodies buried during the early years of the war. Although the full details of Action 1005 would only become clear later through testimonies and captured documents, the physical evidence found at these sites already suggested that a systematic effort had been made to reopen burial pits and burn the remains. The presence of such evidence also meant that the attempt to hide the crimes had failed in a fundamental way. Even when bodies had been destroyed, the traces left behind in the soil and in the memories of witnesses allowed investigators to reconstruct what had happened. The advancing armies therefore played a crucial role not only in ending German occupation but also in revealing the physical landscapes where the Holocaust had unfolded. As soldiers and investigators moved through these territories, they documented burial pits, cremation sites, and other remnants of the violence that had taken place there. Their reports, photographs, and collected testimonies later became important pieces of evidence used in post-war trials and historical research. The discoveries made during this period demonstrated that despite the efforts of Action 1005 to erase the traces of mass murder, the landscapes of Eastern Europe still contained enough evidence to reveal the crimes committed during the occupation. The forests and fields where graves had once been hidden now became places where the truth about those crimes began to emerge, marking the beginning of a process of investigation and remembrance that would continue long after the war itself had ended. Chapter 8, Segment 3: Investigations, Evidence, and the Reconstruction of the Crimes. As the war moved toward its final phase and territories once controlled by Nazi Germany were gradually liberated, the discovery of burial pits, disturbed ground, and cremation sites prompted a systematic effort by investigators to document the crimes that had taken place during the occupation and to understand the attempts made by the SS to destroy the evidence through operations such as Action 1005. The first examinations of these sites were often conducted quickly in the immediate aftermath of liberation, as military officials and local authorities sought to determine what had occurred in forests, ravines, and rural fields where witnesses had reported mass shootings or where the ground showed signs of disturbance. In many cases, investigators encountered graves that had not been touched by Action 1005 teams before the German retreat, and the opening of these burial pits revealed the remains of large numbers of victims who had been executed during the early phase of the Holocaust. Layers of bodies were sometimes found stacked within trenches that had been dug during the shootings, with clothing, shoes, documents, and personal belongings still present among the remains. These items helped identify the victims and provided important clues about the communities from which they had been taken. At other locations, investigators encountered burial sites that had clearly been reopened before the arrival of Allied or Soviet forces. In these places, the ground had been disturbed and leveled again, and nearby there were signs that fires had once burned intensely. Metal fragments, pieces of railway tracks, and traces of ash mixed into the soil indicated that cremation platforms had been constructed and used to destroy the bodies originally buried there. The presence of such evidence revealed that the graves had not simply been abandoned but had been deliberately altered in an effort to remove the remains of the victims. This discovery led investigators to realize that the destruction of evidence had been carried out in a coordinated way rather than as isolated actions by individual units. As more sites were examined across different regions, the pattern became clearer. Burial pits created during the mass shootings of 1941 and 1942 had later been reopened by German security forces who forced prisoners to exhume the bodies and burn them on large open-air cremation structures. The ashes had then been scattered or buried again, and the ground had been leveled in an attempt to make the sites appear undisturbed. Witness testimonies collected from local residents and surviving prisoners provided further confirmation of this process. Villagers described how German units had returned to forests where shootings had previously occurred, bringing prisoners who were forced to dig into the graves and carry bodies to large fires that burned for days. Some witnesses remembered seeing smoke rising from these forests or smelling the fires from a distance. Others spoke about hearing guards shouting orders to prisoners who were working under armed supervision. These accounts helped investigators reconstruct the sequence of events that had taken place at each site. The testimonies of prisoners who had survived the labor detachments used in Action 1005 were especially valuable. These survivors described in detail how cremation platforms had been built from railway tracks supported by stone or brick structures, allowing air to circulate beneath the stacked bodies so that the fires could burn intensely enough to reduce the remains to ash. They also explained how prisoners were forced to crush bone fragments after the fires had burned out and scatter the ashes across the ground in order to eliminate any recognizable evidence of the victims. Such descriptions matched the physical traces discovered by investigators, strengthening the conclusion that a systematic effort had been made to conceal the earlier massacres. As more evidence was gathered, reports documenting these discoveries were compiled by investigative commissions and later used during post-war trials of Nazi officials and SS officers. Photographs taken at the sites showed burial pits filled with bodies as well as areas where cremation fires had once burned. Forensic examinations attempted to determine the causes of death in cases where remains were still present, often confirming that victims had been shot before being buried. These investigations also demonstrated that the attempt to destroy evidence had been incomplete. While many bodies had been burned, fragments of bone and other traces still remained in the soil, and the testimonies of witnesses ensured that the locations of execution sites could not easily be forgotten. Over time, historians studying the Holocaust used these reports and testimonies to reconstruct the broader history of Action 1005 and the earlier mass shootings it sought to conceal. By comparing documents, survivor accounts, and the physical evidence discovered in the landscape, researchers were able to identify patterns showing how the operation had been organized and implemented across different regions. This work revealed that the attempt to erase the traces of mass murder had itself become part of the historical record of the Holocaust. Instead of eliminating the evidence entirely, the operation left behind a complex set of clues that allowed investigators to uncover both the crimes themselves and the later efforts to hide them. The forests and fields where burial pits had once existed, therefore, became important sites of historical investigation. Beneath the leveled ground and scattered ashes remained fragments of the past that helped tell the story of what had occurred there. Through the work of investigators, survivors, and historians, the events that Action 1005 had attempted to erase gradually became known to the world. The reconstruction of these crimes demonstrated that even the most determined effort to destroy evidence could not completely silence the truth when physical traces, witness memories, and careful investigation combined to reveal what had taken place. Chapter 9, Segment 1. Post-war investigations and the search for accountability. When the Second World War finally came to an end in Europe in May 1945, the defeat of Nazi Germany opened the possibility for investigators, governments, and international courts to begin examining the immense network of crimes that had been committed during the years of occupation and war. And among the many aspects of the Holocaust that required investigation was the secret operation known as Action 1005, the program organized by the SS to destroy the physical evidence of mass shootings by reopening burial pits and burning the bodies of victims across large parts of Eastern Europe. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied and Soviet authorities faced the enormous challenge of documenting crimes that had taken place across vast territories where many execution sites had been deliberately altered in an attempt to hide what had happened there. The discovery of burial pits, cremation grounds, and disturbed landscapes had already begun during the final months of the war as advancing armies liberated regions that had been under German control. Yet these early discoveries represented only the beginning of a much longer process of investigation. In order to establish accountability for the crimes of the Holocaust, investigators needed to reconstruct the sequence of events that had taken place during the occupation, identify those responsible, and gather evidence strong enough to support legal proceedings against individuals who had participated in the system of persecution and mass murder. Action 1005 presented a particular challenge in this regard because it had been designed specifically to eliminate evidence. Many of the burial sites connected to earlier massacres had been reopened, and the bodies that once lay within them had been burned on large cremation platforms built in forests and remote areas. The ashes had then been scattered or buried again, and the ground had been leveled in an effort to erase any visible traces of the graves. For investigators arriving after the war, this meant that the physical remains of the victims were often no longer present in a form that could easily be examined. Nevertheless, the effort to conceal the crimes had not been entirely successful. In many places, fragments of bone, ashes mixed into the soil, and remnants of cremation structures remained visible to those who carefully studied the sites. Even when burial pits had been emptied, the ground often showed signs of disturbance that suggested earlier excavation. These physical clues became the starting point for forensic examinations conducted by investigative teams. Experts in medicine, archaeology, and forensic science worked together to analyze the soil, recover fragments of remains, and determine what had occurred at each location. Their findings were often supported by testimonies from local residents who had witnessed the arrival of German units during the occupation and remembered when groups of victims had been taken to forests or ravines where gunfire followed. Some villagers also recalled the later return of German security units that reopened the graves and burned the bodies, bringing prisoners who were forced to carry out the labor under armed supervision. These testimonies helped investigators connect the disturbed burial sites to the broader system of mass shootings carried out by German forces during the early years of the war. Another crucial source of information came from survivors who had been forced to participate in the labor detachments associated with Action 1005. A small number of these prisoners had managed to escape during the operation or had survived long enough to give testimony after the war ended. Their accounts provided detailed descriptions of how the SS teams organized the reopening of graves and the construction of cremation platforms made from railway tracks supported by stone or metal frames. They explained how prisoners were ordered to dig into burial pits, remove decomposed bodies, stack them onto the platforms, and ignite fires that burned for days until little remained but ash and bone fragments. Survivors also described how the SS attempted to eliminate witnesses by executing the labor detachments once the work at a particular site had been completed. These testimonies became powerful evidence during post-war investigations because they revealed not only the earlier massacres but also the deliberate attempt to destroy the evidence of those crimes. As the Allied powers established international and national courts to prosecute leading figures of the Nazi regime, investigators gathered documents and witness statements that could be used in legal proceedings. One of the most significant trials in this process was the International Military Tribunal held in Nuremberg, where major Nazi officials were charged with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. Although Action 1005 itself was only one part of the broader system of atrocities examined during these proceedings, the operation illustrated the lengths to which the Nazi leadership had gone in attempting to hide the reality of the Holocaust. Documents discovered in captured German archives revealed the involvement of SS officers in organizing the program, and testimony from witnesses helped demonstrate how the operation had been implemented across multiple regions. In addition to the major international trials, numerous national courts in Europe later conducted their own investigations and prosecutions of individuals who had participated in Nazi crimes. These proceedings often relied on the evidence gathered during the early post-war investigations, including the reports documenting burial sites and cremation grounds connected to Action 1005. Historians and legal experts studying these materials recognized that the attempt to erase the evidence of mass murder had itself become evidence of the crime. The existence of an organized operation dedicated to destroying bodies and altering execution sites demonstrated a clear awareness among the perpetrators that the actions they had carried out were criminal and would require concealment. In this sense, Action 1005 served as a powerful reminder of the systematic nature of the Holocaust. It showed that the same regime that had organized mass shootings across Eastern Europe had later devoted significant resources to hiding the traces of those killings once the war began to turn against Germany. The post-war investigations therefore played an essential role not only in seeking justice but also in reconstructing the historical record of what had occurred during the occupation. Through the combined efforts of investigators, survivors, and local witnesses, the story of Action 1005 gradually emerged from the fragments of evidence left behind in forests, fields, and archives. The process of uncovering these crimes demonstrated that even an operation specifically designed to erase the past could not completely eliminate the traces of what had happened. By carefully examining the landscape, collecting testimonies, and studying captured documents, investigators were able to piece together the history of the operation and ensure that the attempt to destroy evidence did not succeed in preventing accountability for the crimes of the Holocaust. Chapter 9, Segment 2: Trials, Testimonies, and the Exposure of Action 1005. In the years immediately following the end of the Second World War, the international effort to investigate and prosecute crimes committed under the Nazi regime expanded into one of the largest legal and historical examinations ever undertaken. And within this process, the story of Action 1005 gradually emerged through the testimonies of witnesses, captured documents, and the careful work of prosecutors who sought to expose the system that had attempted to erase the evidence of the Holocaust. At first, the full scope of the operation was not widely understood, even among investigators who were already examining mass graves and execution sites across Eastern Europe. The operation had been carried out under conditions of extreme secrecy, and the SS units responsible for implementing it had avoided leaving extensive written records that could easily reveal their activities. Yet fragments of documentation survived within the archives of German administrative offices and security services that had been captured by Allied forces. These documents included orders, correspondence, and reports that hinted at the existence of an organized program designed to reopen burial pits and destroy the bodies of victims who had been murdered during earlier phases of the war. One of the key figures connected to this operation was SS officer Paul Blobel, who had previously commanded Einsatzkommando units involved in mass shootings and was later assigned responsibility for organizing the systematic destruction of mass graves. During the investigations that followed the war, Blobel and other SS personnel were identified through captured records and witness testimonies as individuals who had played central roles in coordinating the exhumation and cremation operations carried out across occupied territories. When these individuals were brought before courts during post-war trials, prosecutors sought to demonstrate not only their involvement in mass killings, but also their participation in the deliberate effort to conceal those crimes through Action 1005. The trials therefore became important arenas in which the details of the operation were publicly revealed. Witnesses who had survived the labor detachments forced to work at cremation sites described in careful detail how the SS units organized the reopening of graves, the construction of cremation platforms made from railway tracks, and the continuous fires that burned for days as bodies were reduced to ash. Many of these witnesses had escaped or survived under extraordinary circumstances, and their testimonies were often delivered years after the events had occurred. Yet their descriptions frequently matched each other in remarkable ways, reinforcing the credibility of their accounts. They explained how prisoners were ordered to dig into burial pits filled with decomposed bodies and carry the remains to large metal structures where fires were ignited beneath layers of wood and corpses. They spoke about the smell of smoke drifting through forests, the constant presence of armed guards, and the knowledge that once the work was finished, the labor detachments themselves would likely be executed in order to eliminate witnesses. These testimonies helped prosecutors demonstrate that Action 1005 was not an isolated or spontaneous effort, but rather a coordinated operation implemented across many regions as the German leadership attempted to hide the evidence of mass shootings. The trials also relied heavily on the physical evidence gathered during post-war investigations of execution sites. Reports compiled by forensic experts documented the presence of disturbed soil, ash mixed with earth, fragments of bone, and remnants of cremation structures that had once been used to burn bodies. Photographs taken during these examinations were presented in court to illustrate the locations where burial pits had been reopened and the remains of victims destroyed. Although many of the bodies themselves had been burned, the traces left behind in the soil provided strong indications that large-scale cremation operations had taken place. In addition to physical evidence, prosecutors also introduced captured German documents that referred to the activities of special units responsible for eliminating traces of earlier massacres. While these documents were often written in administrative language that avoided explicit descriptions of the crimes, their context became clearer when combined with the testimonies of witnesses who had participated in or observed the operations. Through this combination of documentary evidence and survivor accounts, the courts were able to establish a more complete understanding of how Action 1005 had been organized and implemented. The exposure of the operation during these trials had a profound impact on the historical understanding of the Holocaust. It revealed that the Nazi regime had not only carried out mass murder on an enormous scale, but had also attempted to systematically erase the physical traces of those crimes once it became clear that the war might end in defeat. This realization added another dimension to the narrative of the Holocaust by showing how the perpetrators sought to manipulate both the landscape and the historical record in order to avoid accountability. The trials demonstrated that even in the midst of war, the Nazi leadership had been aware that the mass killings they had organized would be judged as criminal if exposed. The very existence of Action 1005 therefore served as evidence of a deliberate attempt to conceal wrongdoing. As the proceedings continued in different courts across Europe, the testimonies and documents related to the operation were gradually incorporated into a broader body of historical knowledge about the Holocaust. Historians studying these materials recognized that the effort to destroy evidence had itself become an important part of the story. The forests where burial pits had once existed, the cremation platforms built from railway tracks, and the ashes scattered across the ground were all remnants of a final attempt to hide the crimes that had already taken place. Yet the combination of survivor testimony, forensic investigation, and legal examination ensured that this attempt ultimately failed. By bringing the details of Action 1005 into the public record, the post-war trials transformed what had once been a secret operation into a documented chapter of history. The stories told in courtrooms and recorded in investigative reports ensured that the landscapes where the evidence had been burned would still speak through the memories and testimonies of those who had witnessed the events, allowing the truth about the operation to survive long after the war had ended. Chapter 9, Segment 3: Historical Documentation and the Preservation of Evidence. In the decades that followed the end of the Second World War, the effort to understand and document the full scope of the Holocaust continued to expand through the work of historians, archivists, investigators, and survivors who sought to preserve the truth about what had taken place across Europe. And within this broader effort, the history of Action 1005 gradually became clearer as researchers examined documents, testimonies, and physical evidence connected to the operation that had attempted to erase the traces of mass murder. During the immediate post-war years, many investigations focused primarily on the most visible crimes of the Nazi regime, including the operation of concentration camps, extermination camps, and the large-scale massacres carried out by mobile killing units in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe. Yet the discovery of disturbed burial sites, cremation grounds, and survivor testimonies describing the reopening of graves revealed that there had also been a systematic attempt to conceal these crimes before the war ended. Understanding how and why this effort had taken place required a long process of historical research that unfolded gradually as archives were opened, documents were recovered, and witnesses came forward with their memories. Historians working in Europe and elsewhere began examining captured German administrative records preserved in national archives, including correspondence between SS officers and reports describing security operations in occupied territories. Within these documents, researchers sometimes found indirect references to activities that matched the descriptions given by survivors who had been forced to work in the labor detachments connected to Action 1005. Although many of the records avoided explicit language about the destruction of bodies, the context provided by witness testimonies allowed historians to interpret these documents as evidence of a coordinated program designed to eliminate the physical remains of victims who had been murdered during earlier mass shootings. The testimonies of survivors played a crucial role in this reconstruction of events. Some individuals who had escaped from the labor detachments or survived until liberation later provided detailed interviews describing how graves were reopened and how bodies were burned on large metal structures constructed from railway tracks and other materials. These accounts explained how prisoners were forced to dig into burial pits, remove decomposed remains, stack them onto the cremation platforms, and ignite fires that burned continuously until the bodies were reduced to ash. Survivors also described how the ashes were scattered across the ground and how the SS attempted to level the soil in order to hide the original burial pits. When historians compared these testimonies with the physical evidence discovered at former execution sites, the descriptions proved remarkably consistent. Investigations of disturbed landscapes often revealed traces that matched the survivors' accounts, including fragments of bone mixed into the soil, remains of metal structures that had once supported cremation fires, and areas where the ground had clearly been excavated and refilled. Through this process of comparison between testimony and physical evidence, historians were able to confirm that Action 1005 had been carried out across a wide geographic area and had involved the systematic destruction of bodies from earlier massacres. The documentation of these events also relied heavily on the work of institutions created to preserve the memory of the Holocaust and collect historical records related to Nazi crimes. Archives dedicated to documenting the persecution of Jewish communities and other victim groups began gathering witness statements, photographs, and official records that could be used by researchers studying the war. Survivors who had lived through the occupation were encouraged to record their memories so that future generations would understand what had happened during those years. Within these collections, historians found numerous references to execution sites where graves had later been reopened and bodies burned, reinforcing the understanding that Action 1005 had been an organized effort to conceal the earlier phase of mass shootings. Over time, the accumulation of evidence from multiple sources allowed scholars to reconstruct the structure and purpose of the operation with increasing clarity. They identified the SS leadership responsible for organizing the program, the units assigned to carry out the work, and the regions where the exhumations and cremations had taken place. This research demonstrated that the attempt to destroy evidence had itself become part of the historical record of the Holocaust. Instead of disappearing completely, the traces left behind by the operation, both physical and documentary, provided important insights into how the perpetrators sought to manipulate the landscape in order to hide their crimes. The study of Action 1005 therefore contributed to a deeper understanding of the Holocaust not only as a system of mass murder but also as a system that attempted to conceal its own actions when defeat began to appear possible. The preservation of evidence related to the operation also carried a broader significance for historical memory. By documenting the attempts to erase the traces of the massacres, historians highlighted the importance of protecting physical sites, archival materials, and witness testimonies that could reveal the truth about the past. Many former execution sites became places of remembrance where memorials were established to honor the victims whose remains had once been buried there. Even in cases where the bodies had been destroyed, the locations themselves remained powerful reminders of what had occurred. Through continued research, publication, and education, the story of Action 1005 was gradually integrated into the wider narrative of the Holocaust. What had once been a secret program carried out in remote forests and fields became a documented chapter of history studied by scholars and remembered by communities across Europe. The effort to preserve this knowledge ensured that the attempt to erase the evidence of mass murder ultimately failed. Instead of disappearing into silence, the events connected to Action 1005 became part of the historical record that continues to inform understanding of the Holocaust and the broader consequences of the crimes committed during the war. Chapter 10, Segment 1. The Landscapes that Remained. After the end of the Second World War, the landscapes across Eastern Europe where the mass shootings of the Holocaust had taken place remained quiet in a way that contrasted sharply with the violence that had unfolded there only a few years earlier. And although Action 1005 had attempted to erase the physical evidence of those crimes by reopening graves and burning the bodies of victims, the forests, ravines, and fields where these events occurred continued to carry traces of what had happened. Beneath their surface, many of these places had once been ordinary locations in the countryside, areas where people gathered wood, walked along rural paths, or worked nearby farmland. During the years of German occupation, however, they had been transformed into sites of mass execution where thousands of men, women, and children were brought under armed guard and killed in organized shootings carried out by German security units and their collaborators. The victims were buried in large pits dug into the soil, and for a time those graves remained hidden from wider view. Later, when the German leadership became increasingly concerned that the advancing war might expose these crimes, the operation known as Action 1005 was launched in order to remove the bodies and destroy the evidence of the massacres. Prisoners were forced to reopen the graves, remove the remains, and burn them on large cremation structures built in remote clearings. After the fires died down, The ashes were scattered and the ground was leveled in an effort to make the sites appear as though nothing unusual had ever occurred there. Yet despite these attempts at concealment, the landscapes themselves retained subtle signs of disturbance that could still be recognized by investigators and local residents who knew the history of the area. In some places, the soil appeared uneven or darker where ashes had been mixed into the earth. In others, fragments of bone, metal objects, or remnants of cremation platforms were discovered beneath the surface. These physical traces served as reminders that the effort to erase the evidence had never been completely successful. During the years immediately after the war, investigative teams visited many of these sites in order to document what had taken place there. Forensic specialists examined the soil, collected fragments of remains, and recorded the features of the landscape that suggested earlier burial pits had existed. Witnesses from nearby villages were often able to guide investigators to specific locations where shootings had occurred during the occupation. Some residents remembered the arrival of German units that had marched groups of prisoners or civilians toward forests and ravines from which gunfire could later be heard. Others recalled the later return of German personnel who reopened the graves and burned the bodies as part of the effort to conceal the earlier crimes. These memories became an important part of the historical record because they helped identify places that might otherwise have been overlooked once the visible traces of the graves had been removed. Over time, many of these sites were marked by memorials or monuments established to honor the victims whose lives had ended there. The creation of such memorials reflected a growing recognition that the landscapes where the massacres occurred should not be forgotten or allowed to disappear from public awareness. Even when the bodies themselves had been destroyed through the fires of Action 1005, the ground where those events took place remained an important part of the historical memory of the Holocaust. Visitors who came to these sites often encountered quiet forests or open fields that gave little outward indication of the violence that had once unfolded there. Yet beneath the calm surface of these places lay the history of the victims who had been brought there during the occupation and the later attempt to erase the evidence of their deaths. The presence of memorials and historical markers ensured that these locations continued to serve as places of reflection and remembrance. Historians studying the Holocaust also recognized the importance of these landscapes as sources of evidence about the past. By examining the physical environment alongside archival records and witness testimonies, researchers were able to reconstruct the sequence of events that had taken place in many of these remote areas. The disturbed soil, the fragments of bone, and the remnants of cremation structures all contributed to an understanding of how the massacres were carried out and how the later effort to conceal them had been organized. This work demonstrated that even when perpetrators attempted to remove the most obvious traces of their crimes, the landscape itself could still preserve clues about what had occurred. The forests and fields where Action 1005 teams once worked therefore became important locations for historical research and remembrance. They revealed how the attempt to destroy evidence had been carried out, and how the truth about those crimes had eventually been uncovered through careful investigation. In this way, the landscapes of Eastern Europe became silent witnesses to both the violence of the Holocaust and the later efforts to erase its physical traces. Their continued existence reminds observers that history is often written not only in documents and testimonies, but also in the ground itself, where the past leaves marks that endure long after the events have ended. Chapter 10, Segment 2. Remembering the Attempt to Erase History. In the years that followed the end of the Second World War, the effort to remember and understand the Holocaust expanded beyond the immediate investigations and trials that had taken place in the late 1940s, and historians, educators, survivors, and communities across Europe gradually began building a broader culture of remembrance that included not only the victims of Nazi persecution but also the history of how the perpetrators attempted to conceal their crimes through operations such as
Aktion 1005.
At first, the story of this operation remained relatively little known outside the circles of investigators and survivors who had encountered its evidence directly, partly because the destruction of bodies had succeeded in removing many of the physical remains that might have drawn immediate attention to the sites of earlier massacres. Yet, as historical research expanded in the decades after the war, scholars began examining the surviving documents, testimonies, and forensic reports that described how the SS had reopened mass graves and burned the bodies of victims in an effort to eliminate the traces of the mass shootings that had occurred during the early phase of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. These studies revealed that Action 1005 represented one of the final stages of a broader system of persecution and murder, a stage in which the perpetrators attempted to manipulate both the landscape and the historical record in order to avoid accountability if the war ended in defeat. The recognition of this effort to erase evidence added an important dimension to the understanding of the Holocaust because it showed that the perpetrators were aware that the crimes they had committed could one day be exposed and judged by the outside world. The decision to organize teams that reopened graves, built cremation platforms, and scattered ashes across forests and fields demonstrated a calculated attempt to hide the truth of what had taken place. For survivors and historians studying the period, the existence of this operation became a powerful reminder of how the Nazi regime sought not only to destroy lives, but also to remove the traces of those lives from the historical record. As more testimonies from survivors were collected and archived, the experiences of those who had been forced to work in the labor detachments connected to Action 1005 became part of the larger narrative of the Holocaust. These individuals described the disturbing task of digging into burial pits and handling the remains of victims who had been murdered months or even years earlier. They recalled the construction of cremation structures made from railway tracks and wood, the fires that burned for days in remote forests, and the constant presence of guards who ensured that the prisoners carried out their work under strict supervision. Many survivors also remembered the fear that they themselves would be executed once the operation at a particular site was completed, a fear that often proved justified when labor detachments were eliminated to prevent witnesses from surviving. By recording and preserving these testimonies, historians ensured that the attempt to destroy evidence did not succeed in silencing the memory of what had happened. Educational institutions, museums, and memorial organizations gradually incorporated the history of Action 1005 into their exhibitions and research programs, helping the public understand how the effort to conceal mass murder had been organized and why it ultimately failed. The preservation of execution sites and former burial areas also became an important part of remembrance. In many regions, local communities and historical organizations worked together to identify locations where massacres had taken place and where graves had later been reopened during the operation. Memorials were erected in forests, ravines, and fields to honor the victims whose remains had once been buried there. These sites often appeared quiet and undisturbed to visitors, yet the memorials served as reminders that beneath the surface lay the history of lives that had been violently taken and then deliberately hidden. The presence of such memorials reflected a broader commitment to ensuring that the past would not disappear from public awareness. By marking the landscapes where the crimes had occurred, communities preserved the connection between the physical environment and the historical events that had taken place there. The remembrance of Action 1005 therefore became part of a larger effort to confront the legacy of the Holocaust and to recognize the importance of preserving historical truth, even when perpetrators had attempted to erase it. Scholars studying the Holocaust often emphasize that the operation designed to destroy evidence ultimately failed in its central goal. Although thousands of bodies were burned and many burial pits were emptied, enough traces remained in the soil, in witness memories, and in captured documents to allow investigators and historians to reconstruct the events. The discovery of disturbed graves, fragments of bone, and remnants of cremation structures provided physical confirmation that the operation had taken place, while the testimonies of survivors and local residents filled in the details of how it had been carried out. Through the combined efforts of investigators, historians, and communities committed to remembrance, the history of Action 1005 became known as an example of the lengths to which the Nazi regime attempted to conceal the crimes of the Holocaust. The act of remembering these events serves not only to honor the victims but also to demonstrate that attempts to erase the past cannot succeed when evidence is preserved and voices continue to speak about what occurred. In this way, the story of Action 1005 became part of the enduring historical record, reminding future generations that even deliberate efforts to hide mass violence cannot fully eliminate the truth when memory, research, and remembrance work together to reveal it. Chapter 10, Segment 3. The Quiet Ground and the Enduring Memory. Today, many of the places connected to the events surrounding Action 1005 appear calm and ordinary to anyone who visits them for the first time, and it is often difficult to imagine that these same landscapes were once part of one of the most deliberate attempts in modern history to erase the physical evidence of mass murder. Forest paths run quietly through trees that have grown for decades since the war ended. Open fields stretch across rural countryside where farms and villages continue their daily life, and the ground itself often gives no immediate indication of the terrible events that once unfolded there. Yet beneath this quiet surface lies a history that cannot be fully erased. The operation that sought to remove the traces of earlier massacres succeeded in destroying many of the bodies that had once been buried in mass graves. But it did not succeed in eliminating the memory of what had occurred. Over time, the combination of survivor testimonies, historical research, and the careful work of investigators ensured that the events connected to Action 1005 became known and documented as part of the broader history of the Holocaust. The places where graves were once opened and fires once burned now exist as silent witnesses to that history. In some locations, memorials have been established to mark the sites where victims lost their lives during the mass shootings carried out by German security units during the early years of the war. These memorials often stand in forests or at the edges of fields where burial pits were once dug, reminding visitors that the peaceful appearance of the landscape today conceals a much darker past. The presence of such memorials reflects the understanding that remembering the victims and the crimes committed against them is an essential part of preserving historical truth. When people visit these sites, they often encounter an atmosphere of quiet reflection. The absence of visible graves or remains does not diminish the significance of the place. Rather, it highlights the fact that an effort was once made to remove those traces entirely. The ground that appears smooth and undisturbed may have been leveled after cremation fires burned there decades earlier, and the ashes of victims may still rest within the soil. For historians and educators, these landscapes provide an opportunity to explain how the Holocaust unfolded, not only through the establishment of camps and ghettos, but also through the mass shootings carried out across vast territories of Eastern Europe. They also illustrate how the perpetrators later attempted to conceal the evidence of those crimes once the war began to turn against them. By studying these places and the historical records connected to them, researchers have been able to reconstruct the story of Action 1005 and place it within the larger narrative of the Holocaust. The operation revealed that the Nazi leadership was aware that the mass killings carried out during the war would one day require explanation, and the attempt to destroy the bodies of victims demonstrated a calculated effort to hide the truth from the outside world. Yet the failure of that effort also demonstrates the resilience of historical memory. Even when physical remains were burned and burial pits emptied, enough evidence survived in the form of witness testimonies, disturbed landscapes, and captured documents to reveal what had happened. The survivors who managed to escape or live long enough to share their experiences played an essential role in ensuring that the story of the operation would not disappear. Their accounts provided detailed descriptions of the work they were forced to carry out, the cremation structures built in remote forests, and the fear that they would be killed once the work was complete. Through their voices, the events connected to Action 1005 entered the historical record and became part of the larger effort to document the Holocaust. The preservation of these testimonies has allowed later generations to understand not only the violence of the mass shootings themselves, but also the deliberate attempt to erase the evidence afterward. In this way, the story of Action 1005 serves as a reminder that historical truth often survives even when those responsible attempt to destroy it. The landscapes where the operation took place may appear peaceful today, yet they remain connected to the past through the memories of those who witnessed the events and the work of historians who continue to study them. As time passes and the generation that lived through the war gradually disappears, the responsibility for preserving this knowledge increasingly rests with institutions, educators, and communities committed to remembering what occurred. Museums, archives, and memorial organizations continue to collect documents and testimonies so that the history of the Holocaust can be studied and understood by future generations. The story of Action 1005 therefore becomes part of a broader lesson about the importance of preserving evidence and memory in the face of attempts to erase the past. The quiet ground where graves once existed reminds visitors that beneath the surface of ordinary landscapes, there may lie histories that demand recognition and reflection. Remembering these events ensures that the victims of the Holocaust are not forgotten and that the attempt to remove the traces of their suffering ultimately failed. The forests and fields where the operation once took place now stand as places where silence invites reflection and where the persistence of memory ensures that the truth continues to endure long after the war itself has ended. The forests where Action 1005 once took place are quiet today. Trees grow where cremation fires once burned. Paths pass through places where the ground was once opened and then closed again. For those who visit these landscapes now, there is often very little to see.
No smoke.
No movement, only stillness. Yet the history remains. Action 1005 was designed to erase the evidence of mass murder. Graves were reopened, bodies were burned, ashes were scattered across fields and forests. But the past could not be completely removed. Fragments of evidence remained in the soil. Witnesses survived. Investigators documented what they found. And historians later pieced together the story of what had happened. Today we know that the attempt to hide these crimes ultimately failed. The truth endured through memory, testimony, and careful historical research. Places that once held mass graves are now places of remembrance. They remind us not only of the victims of the Holocaust, but also of the effort that was made to conceal the crime itself. Understanding this history is part of preserving it, and remembering it ensures that the voices that were meant to disappear are still heard. If you value calm, carefully researched Holocaust history told with respect and clarity, consider subscribing to In&Out Nazi Germany. Thank you for listening, and thank you for remembering.